So what is PIDS? For over 40 years, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, has been the country's foremost socio-economic think tank. It conducts rigorous and objective policy research and analyses that help the government in crafting relevant policies, plans, and programs in support of the country's long-term vision and development goals. PIDS pursues its mandate through three basic programs. So what is PIDS? For over 40 years, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, has been the country's foremost socio-economic think tank. It conducts rigorous and objective policy research and analyses that help the government in crafting relevant policies, plans, and programs in support of the country's long-term vision and development goals. PIDS pursues its mandate through three basic programs: research, dissemination, and outreach. Through its research program, PIDS identifies and prioritizes studies, develops proposals, and conducts research on priority areas. The results of these studies are then disseminated through different platforms, publications, online resources, PIDS Corner, seminars, and the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, held every September. To shed light on key policy issues, the advice and expertise of the Institute's research fellows are also sought by policymakers, government agencies, private sector, and civil society. Since 1977, PIDS has completed numerous policy studies on a wide range of development topics. This brand of service has then translated to policies and programs that have improved the lives of every Filipino. Philippine Institute for Development Studies, service through policy research.
In need of references for your research? Do you want a search engine that is easy to navigate? And do you want it free? If you are a student, researcher, or teacher looking for socioeconomic references and materials, then CERPI is for you. To access CERPI, just visit the PIDS website at www.pids.gov.ph and click the CERPI widget. Or type serp-p.pids.gov.ph. CERPI is an online database of socioeconomic studies and materials produced by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies and other academic and research institutions. CERPI has a wide variety of socioeconomic materials such as journal articles, books, working papers, policy notes, research papers, and newsletters. CERPI has 52 partner institutions that contribute publications to the database. CERPI has a wide coverage of materials encompassing 20 research themes. You can search by keyword or author, by publication type, by research theme, or year published. CERPI has more than 7,000 materials with full text that you can download for free. Enjoy searching! Visit CERPI now and follow us on Facebook. You may also send a message for inquiries.
Oo, dapat nilang pag-aralan yung batas at polisiya para mas makita nila yung epekto at resulta nito.
Pag nahuli tayo, wala tayong maisasagot. Kaya dapat pag-aralan din natin.
Oo, dapat nilang pag-aralan ng mga batas at polisiya para malaman nila kung epektibo ba ito sa karamihan o magiging problema lang.
Kung walang basehan ng isang batas, basta na lamang ipatutupad at walang pulso na kinukuha sa mga mamamayan, mahirap.
Mahalagang isailalim sa masusing pagsusuri ang mga polisiya at programa ng pamahalaan bago pa man ito ipatupad. Dapat ring ipagpatuloy ang pagsubaybay o pagmonitor sa mga ito habang ipinapatupad hanggang sa matapos ang kanilang implementasyon. Dito pumapasok ang tungkulin na ginagampanan ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies. Ang PIDS ang siyang sangay ng pamahalaan na naatasang gumawa ng pag-aaral at pananaliksik at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas at iba't ibang sangay ng gobyerno tungkol sa mga programa at polisiya sa pamahalaan upang masigurong matugunan nito ang socio-economic needs ng ating bansa.
Pag pinag-aralan, mas effective!
Hi. How are you doing? It's us, UA&P. Before moving forward, let's go back, shall we? COVID-19 hit. Classes got suspended. Alternatives were being devised for academics, extracurricular activities, and family life. Since times have changed, we need to bring something different. Effective. Safe. Now with the new normal, UA&P is ready for you. This will only work if we do this together. Are you with me?
Through a powerful combination of liberal arts education and professional specialization, the University of Asia and the Pacific puts due emphasis on the individual, the family, the community, and the Asia-Pacific region.
The distinctive approach to learning has made UA&P all that it is today in such a short time. A school environment conducive for study, experienced and dedicated teachers, an excellent faculty-to-student ratio, well-maintained facilities.
The private not-for-profit institute has only been around for 2 decades, yet UA&P has already grown into its own as one of the top schools in the country.
Our mission is to fully develop everything that is human in the individual, whole person education.
UA&P is committed to the inculcation of time-tested human values and attitudes, and our academic programs include courses in social and professional ethics.
With UA&P's brand of whole person education, amidst a working climate where adaptability is key, we stand firm, knowing that every facet of what we have learned can be fully utilized to catch up to the speed of life.
Unique to our university, our mentoring program, augmented by our deep appreciation for the liberal arts, nourishes the development of each of our students and brings the integration of knowledge, skills, and values down to the personal level.
By treating students as individuals, through focused one-on-one sessions with qualified mentors, we put into practice our belief that higher education should be a singular, meaningful experience that develops the person in every aspect.
This holistic approach prepares UA&P's diverse community of students from all over the world to become innovative and globally relevant professionals at the top of their field, wherever they may be.
While we are constantly looking towards the future, we never lose sight of who we are. With the UA&P motto, Unitas.
We remind ourselves of our desire to achieve unity in many aspects. Unity within university community, unity between faith and reason, unity between religion and life. It reflects the commitment of everyone in UA&P toward the pursuit of wisdom, a synthesis, and therefore a unity of life.
Welcome to the PIDS webinar series. Before we start the webinar, we would like to give you a few reminders. For attendees, your microphone is muted upon entry. In case you have a question, the moderator will read it during the open forum. For those attending via Cisco WebEx, use the chat box located at the lower part of the screen. Click the chat icon, type your name and affiliation and your question, and send to all panelists. You may send your questions while the presentation is in progress. The moderator will read them during the open forum. For Facebook viewers, at least 2 questions from the comment section will be read by the moderator during the open forum. We will moderate all questions to ensure that they are relevant to the scope of the presentation. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your active participation.
Good morning, everyone. May we request everyone to please rise for the Philippine National Anthem.
Bayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Sayang mag-ibig, pero sa sinakalan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y bumay. Lupang hinirang, tuyan ka ng mahirap. sisingil sa nanagang tutok sa simoy at sa langit pagpagaw ay tinatang tula at awit sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang isang ng matawad ko'y tagumpay na nag-iibig. Ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di matitigil. Lumang ang araw ng walang pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang higaya ng pagkay mga amin at mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Good morning again, everyone. My name is Beng Kalma Alcazaran from the University of Asia and the Pacific, and I am your host for this morning's symposium. This event is co-organized by UA&P in partnership with the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, as lead institution of Philippine APEC Study Center Network, or PASCN. This year's theme, Navigating the New Normal, Restarting and Rebuilding Global MSMEs, is in support of our Department of Trade and Industries APEC initiative on the final review of the Boracay Action Agenda, or BAA, for MSMEs, of which BAA was endorsed by trade ministers in May 2015 and adopted by APEC Economic Leaders in 2015. This symposium is one of PASCN's Information Dissemination Program, a venue where researchers can present the key findings of their studies and solicit comments from various stakeholders. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the following. From the government sector, Department of Foreign Affairs Director Joselito Chad Jacinto, Department of Foreign Affairs Director Ivan Frank Olea, House of Representatives Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department Executive Director Manuel Aquino, Department of Tourism Regional Director Woodrow Makiling Jr., Department of Science and Technology Regional Director Alfonso Alangban, Mindanao Development Authority Deputy Executive Director Romeo Montenegro, Mindanao Development Authority Director Charlita Escano, Department of Trade and Industry OIC Director Abigail Zurita, Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas Managing Director Zeno Ronald Abenoja, Cooperative Development Authority Executive Director Ray Elevazo, Philippine National Deputy Director Domingo Cabillan, Development Academy of the Philippines Director Samuel Rosal, and PIDIG Ilocos Norte Mayor Eduardo Eddie Guillen. From the private sector, 8A Properties and Realty Development Corporation President and CEO Antonio Licuanan, Quantum Resources and Management Consultant CEO Rolando Silva, Vicron Resources OPC CEO Bernadette Vidanes, VPF Creative Marketing Communications CEO Angelito Pagayon, BNS Performance Material Corporation COO Ian Bingabing, Torre Lorenzo Development Corporation Chief Financial Officer Emmanuel Rapadas, 7B Marketing Consulting CEO Kevin Lazarito, Cruz Fabs Food Corporation President and Chairman Omar Cruz, Miracle Soybean Food International Cooperation President Renato Reyes, Ascend Inc. Vice President Jeffrey Gatdula, Cargill Philippines Inc. Director Christopher Ilagan, Fusion Asia Initiative Inc. Director Carmina Cruz, Consulus Philippines Country Director Regino Bulan, Lourdes and Sons Realty and Development Corporation Director Maria Lourdes Carmela Lopue, and Good Thinking Research Inc. Research Director Ana Mayor. From the Academe, Miriam College President Laura Del Rosario, University of Ottawa Executive Director Ernesto Cordero, St. Paul University Surigao Dean of the Graduate School Glenn Andrin, University of the Philippines Virata School of Business Dean Joel Tan Torres, Central Luzon State University Dean Matilde Millicent Santos Recto, Southern Luzon State University Dean Marieta Villaverde, and University of Southeastern Philippines Dean Gilberto Gordo. And from the CSOs, NGOs, and INGOs, Philippine Exporters Confederation, Inc. Executive President and Chief Operating Officer Senen Carlada, Women's Business Council Philippines President Mylene Abiba, and Masaganang Sakahan Inc. Director Daniel Agustin, and finally, Small Enterprise Research and Development Foundation Trustee Jose Tabada. So that's quite a long list. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. To give the welcome remarks is the President of UA&P. Before his appointment as President in 2015, he served as the Dean of the School of Management. He also sits on the board of non-government organizations that promote good governance and education for the less privileged. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Winston Padojinog.
Dr. Celia Reyes, President of the Philippine Institute of Development Studies and lead convener of the Philippine APEC Study Network, or PASCN. Dr. Francis Quimba, Project Director of the PASCN and Research Fellow of PIDS, are representatives from the different national agencies of government, Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the National Economic and Development Authority, the House of Representatives, Congressional Policy and Budget Research, the Department of Tourism, the Department of Science and Technology, the Department of Environmental and Natural Resources, the Mindanao Development Authority, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, Cooperative Development Authority, the Philippine National Police, our friend from PIDS Ilocos Norte, Mayor Eduardo Guillen, private sector representatives, and to all the distinguished speakers, panelists, and moderators of this symposium and annual gathering. I welcome you all to this symposium on navigating the new normal, restarting and rebuilding the global MSMEs. It is indeed an honor for our institution, the University of Asia and the Pacific, to host this annual symposium and General Assembly. UA&P was among the pioneer institutions that organized the PASCN with the Philippine Institute of Development Studies, PIDS, as the lead institution. Our president then, Dr. Jesus Stanislao, was among the eminent persons of APEC, tasked to assist the APEC chair and host, President Fidel Ramos of the Philippines, with APEC matters and initiatives. The APEC Study Center looks beyond just the promotion of trade. It also represents the spirit of cooperation among institutions to discuss shared multidisciplinary and multidimensional concerns to guide and enlighten the different sectors of the different issues. For instance, for government, in terms of implementing policies and facilitating business activities in the region, for the private sector, of building up productive capacity, harness technology, and for the academe in sharing its independent research and findings. The discussion topics in today's symposium are very important and timely. Among the sectors in the economy badly hit by the lockdown are the micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises, or the MSMEs. This sector represents one of the most important backbones of the economy, responsible for a large share of employment and global output. Restarting and rebuilding this economic engine is vital for the rapid recovery of economies, bringing back the labor force displaced by the business shutdowns to work, restoring peace and security within and among nations, and renewing the fight against global poverty. But MSMEs are emerging from the lockdown, facing a new reality, a new normal that is much different from the pre-lockdown business landscape. Digitization, new competitors, emerging industry structures and supply chains, new consumption behaviors, tastes and preferences are among the realities MSMEs will have to face when the economies begin to open up and the wheel of commerce starts to roll once again. MSMEs need ideas, policy, technological, and even financial support in order to navigate the new normal. The Philippines has championed this cause of MSMEs in several international fora, setting into motion, among others, the Philippine-led Boracay Action Agenda to globalize MSMEs. It also inspired the ASEAN Leaders Declaration on ASEAN's 50th anniversary in 2017. And as a result, the call to integrate MSMEs into the global value chains was reiterated. Priority given to MSMEs in the research agenda was supported. And today, we extend once again this importance given to MSMEs by PASCN, incorporating MSMEs issues among its agenda. With this, I would like to wish everyone another fruitful symposium and annual gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Padojinog. Now for the opening remarks. This will be given by the first woman president of PIDS. She specializes in the field of econometrics and has conducted and published numerous research and policy papers on poverty assessments and evaluations of social protection programs. I would like to call on Dr. Celia Reyes.
Thank you, Beng. President Padojinog, Undersecretary Blesila Lantayona, Ambassador Antonio Basilio, distinguished speakers, fellow government workers, participants from the academe and the private sector, and friends. Welcome to our symposium on navigating the new normal, restarting and rebuilding global MSMEs. This symposium, organized together with the University of Asia and the Pacific, is part of the Philippine APEC Study Center Network's information and dissemination activities, in which we highlight research papers in the country and in the region to contribute to the discussions in APEC. This year, we have chosen this theme in support of New Zealand's hosting of APEC, as it seeks to foster the spirit of cooperation among APEC economies to face the economic challenges felt as the economies begin to recover from the restrictions imposed to control the spread of COVID-19. As recognized by the APEC SME Ministerial Statement released in October 2020, micro, small, and medium enterprises, or MSMEs, are crucial to the socio-economic development of our economies, contributing 40 to 60% to total gross domestic product, or GDP, and employing over 60% of all workers in APEC. In addition, MSMEs make up over 98% of all enterprises in most APEC economies. The unprecedented effects of the COVID-19 crisis on businesses and MSMEs call for APEC economies to remain steadfast in strengthening an enabling environment for MSMEs through policies and measures that will help them recover and build resiliency. To this end, the first session of our symposium brings together experts from other APEC study centers who will discuss developments in their own countries as well as issues in the region. We will hear a report on the initiatives in APEC, particularly on the Philippine initiative on fostering SMEs' participation in regional and global economy, which has resulted to the adoption of the Boracay Action Agenda in 2015. We will hear about other strategies to support MSMEs, such as utilizing trade and mega trade agreements, facilitating e-commerce, and engaging with network partners. Drawing our attention to the domestic front, it is also important to discuss how to revive our local MSMEs as they have been one of the most critically affected by the pandemic. The Department of Trade and Industry reported that as of 29 April 2020, over half of MSMEs had stopped or closed their operations due to the pandemic. Some MSMEs have been forced to close their businesses and lay off employees, while many others are facing difficulty maintaining positive cash turnover. In the second session, we will hear from members of the PASCN who will paint the picture of MSMEs in the country and provide insights on how to support them as our country begins to ease restrictions. We will hear about how to support MSMEs in this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and disruptive world. We will learn about how our MSMEs build and sustain export relationships and the role of financial sophistication in MSME sustainability. Finally, we will hear the results of a very recent survey on MSMEs to hear the challenges they face during the lockdown. Let me thank our speakers for generously sharing their time with us. Special thanks go to DTI Undersecretary Blesila, Lantayona, and Ambassador Antonio Basilio for being with us this morning. I also wish to thank our partner in hosting this event, University of Asia and the Pacific, led by its president, Dr. Winston Conrad Padojinog. Let me also thank our PASCN Secretariat, led by Dr. Francis Quimba, with the excellent support provided by Ms. Mela Mantaring and Ms. Jean Carlos for organizing the symposium, the General Assembly this afternoon, and other activities of the PASCN. Let me also acknowledge the support provided by Gwen de la Cruz from our Research Information Department for hosting this event via WebEx. Finally, allow me to end by inviting everyone to imbibe the spirit of New Zealand's theme for APEC 2021. Join, work, grow, together. Together, let us also learn from the speakers and the discussions. Good morning to everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reyes. Now for our keynote address. This will be given by Ms. Blesila Lantayona. She is the Undersecretary, Regional Operations Group of the Department of Trade and Industry, or DTI. Prior to her appointment as Undersecretary, Usec Lantayona was the Assistant Secretary of DTI Regional Operations Group, in charge of several notable projects, such as Kapatid Mentor MP, Shared Service Facilities, Industry Cluster Enhancement Project, and Great Women Project 2. She holds an MBA degree in International Business from the European School of Management in Paris, France. Please join me in welcoming Undersecretary Lantayona.
Thank you very much, Beng. President Winston Padojinog, University of Asia and the Pacific. Ms. Celia Reyes, President of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies and lead convener of the Philippine APEC Study Center Network, or PASCN. Ambassador Antonio Basilio, Director of Operations of the APEC Business Advisory Council. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for inviting the Department of Trade and Industry to the PASCN General Assembly and Symposium with the theme, Navigating the New Normal, Restarting and Rebuilding Global MSMEs. We are pleased that your chosen theme is in support of the DTI's APEC initiative on the final review of the Boracay Action Agenda to globalize the micro, small, and medium enterprises, recognizing the MSME's significant contribution to the APEC economies. APEC trade ministers adopted the Boracay Action Agenda to globalize the MSMEs in 2015. This final review covers 132 projects implemented since 2016. The APEC member economies have also actively supported the BAA by proposing and implementing relevant projects to their economies. In the same year, the APEC trade ministers also adopted the Iloilo Initiative for Growing Global MSMEs. This sparked the significance of facilitating cross-border trade and promoting market linkages using e-commerce through the establishment of APEC MSME Marketplace web portal. As we push forward the trade agenda, the DTI is working on the promotion of the digital economy as it offers promising opportunities in electronic commerce and digital trade. The internet and the digital economy enable greater economic integration, innovation, as well as robust, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth for the Asia-Pacific region. This is particularly important now more than ever as the world continues to face uncertainties brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the height of the quarantine restrictions, we saw an upward trend on digital onboarding and digital payments. MSMEs were also the first businesses to quickly pivot to the digital technology in response to the new normal of the pandemic. Since the start of this year, we noted that business registration of online businesses has grown to more than 9,000. And last year, we also saw a significant increase in the number of online sellers that registered their business names, climbing to more than 80,000 as compared to around 6,000 from 2018 to 2019. DTI also launched the Control Plus Base Reboot Now, which is a series of free webinars that are targeted to MSMEs who need to transform their businesses digitally, enablers across the entire e-commerce ecosystem provide their expertise and experiences on how to take advantage of the digital space. Control Plus B's Reboot Now is part of the Reboot Package for Online Services, which is a flagship project of the Department of Trade and Industry for the promotion of e-commerce. This program has evolved to cover more in-depth topics in e-commerce and has benefited about 1,400 participants so far. However, more work needs to be done, especially in the area of providing the MSMEs continuous capacity building support to engage in international trade, facilitating access to market, and deeper integration into the global value chain, and addressing the problem of limited access to financing and other barriers to financial inclusion. It is increasingly important for the government and the private sector to work together in sustaining a business landscape where MSMEs can freely trade across borders while pursuing an expansion of our partnerships and programs with industry stakeholders at the local front. I am confident that we will do just this, to continue to work on our common goal to promote sustainable, inclusive growth. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone.
Thank you very much, Usec Lantayona, for that keynote address. And now we proceed to give an introduction to PASCN and an overview of this symposium. We have Dr. Francis Mark Quimba, a research fellow at the PIDS and director of PASCN. He has worked on a number of research topics, including agriculture, trade, and rural development. His current research interest is in the innovation activity of local firms. I present to you Dr. Quimba.
Let me just start to. Okay. I can't. Can you see my slide? No.
Not yet, sir.
Okay, let me just. Okay. All right. How about now?
It's starting, sir.
Okay.
There, okay na po.
All right. So thank you, everyone, and welcome to the symposium. Let me just try to provide you an introduction of the network and an overview of what will transpire in the rest of the session. So on November 23, 1996, the Philippine APEC Study Center Network, or the PASCN, was established by virtue of Administrative Order number 303. It was the government's response to the APEC Leaders education initiatives that called on member economies to foster regional cooperation among higher education and research institutes on key regional economic challenges. The PASCN has provided opportunities for collaborative research among its member institutions and serves as a forum to discuss important regional integration issues as these impact the Philippine economy. One of the major milestones of the network has been the hosting of the APEC Study Center Consortium Conference in 2015 as one of the APEC 2015 SOM2 meetings, and this was held in Boracay. This is part of the PASCN's contribution as one of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Study Centers in APEC member economies. And experts from member institutions continue to actively participate in the annual Study Center Consortium Conference organized by the APEC Host Study Center. And this year's host, as mentioned by Dr. Reyes, is New Zealand. So here are the members of the network. So the lead institution and secretariat is the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. And joining us in the network is AIM, Ateneo de Manila University, Central Luzon State University, De La Salle University, Mindanao State University, Silliman University, University of Asia and the Pacific, which is our co-host and partner for today's symposium, University of San Carlos, University of the Philippines, Xavier University, and the Foreign Service Institute. So these are the objectives of the network. I will not go through, I will not go over them, all of them, but we have actually 4 programs to support these objectives. The research program, the thesis and dissertation assistance program, the information dissemination and publication program, and the technical assistance program. Let me just go over them very quickly. The research program is generally based on the APEC agenda and related issues on regional integration and globalization as these impact the Philippines. So experts from the PASCN member institutions are tapped to do research studies through the provision of research grants. And member institutions also independently carry out their own APEC-related studies. For the thesis and dissertation assistance program, the objective is to extend financial assistance to graduate students of PASCN member institutions in the writing and production of their thesis or dissertation on APEC-related issues. The Technical Assistance Program aims to provide technical assistance to government, and this is in part also because the network is a member of the Technical Board on APEC Matters. And the membership is reaffirmed under Administrative Order Number 20, reorganizing and renaming the Philippine Council on ASEAN and APEC Cooperation, or PCAAC, into the Philippine Council for Regional Cooperation in September of 2011. Finally, the Information and Dissemination Program, of which the Symposium is part, so Symposium, technical workshops, and roundtable discussions are undertaken to disseminate the results of the studies and to solicit comments. And as I've mentioned, this annual symposium is an opportunity to present key findings of the studies conducted by the network members and a forum to discuss important economic issues that impact on regional integration and the Philippines' development agenda. So let me just provide you in this slide a background of some of the MSME research that the network has conducted. So very recently, 2017, 2018, we had 3 projects related to MSMEs. So for today's symposium, as Dr. Reyes has already mentioned, the first session is going to talk about a background of MSMEs research that's been conducted by institutions in the region and in the APEC region. And the second session is going to look at the local picture as going to be described by research that's conducted by members of the network. So this ends my presentation, but let me just ask everyone to please follow us on Facebook and Twitter to get updates on the activities of the network. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Quimba. Before we proceed to session 1, we will be having a virtual photo session of our speakers. I will now turn you over to Ms. Gwen de la Cruz, Information Officer Information Officer of PIDS. Sorry about that. Gwen?
Thank you, Ma'am Beng. May I request everyone for the speakers and moderators to please turn on your videos and put on your best smile. Okay, I am just waiting for the others to turn on their videos. Okay. Yes, let me just check if. All right. Okay, please put on your best smile. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And second batch, put on your best smile, please. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. All right, back to you, Ma'am Beng.
Yes. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you to our speakers. Okay, now we'll move on to our first session. All right. For the first session, this will feature MSME studies with regional and other countries' perspectives carried out by experts from other APEC study centers or ASC. This is in line with one of the PASCN's objectives to collaborate and establish linkages with other ASCs in the region. Our moderator for this first session is Mr. Eduardo Pedrosa, Secretary General of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, or PECC, based in Singapore. He leads the Council's flagship annual report, The State of the Region. He has written extensively on regional issues. He is also a member of the Advisory Board of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, as well as their e-commerce expert group. Mr. Pedrosa, you may now proceed to the first session.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning from Singapore. Good afternoon for those of you who are in different time zones. Professor Winston Padojinog, Dr. Celia Reyes, Undersecretary Blesila, Lantayona, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here today. My congratulations to the Philippine APEC Study Center Network for picking this topic. Our overall topic today of navigating the new normal, restarting and rebuilding global MSMEs, I think is of vital importance to us all. I wanted to introduce this session with a little bit of perspective. Today, I think when we speak of the new normal, I think what people have in mind is dealing really with the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. But I sort of a little bit of a reminder, we used to talk of a new normal following the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. I think in Dr. Padojinog's remarks, he really outlined what the sort of the challenges that we're facing today and what is so different in this current situation. But really, with this particular topic, what we're really trying to get at is that for much of history, trade has been conducted by large firms. For example, two-thirds to 80% of trade has been conducted by these large companies. While much of us don't really doubt the indirect benefits of trade, I think that the challenge is it really possible to make it easier for companies, especially for smaller firms, to get the direct benefits of trade? Can they access larger markets? Can they get cheaper inputs? And in short, can trade be more inclusive? As part of our work, part of our contributions to the Philippine hosting of APEC, we did this survey on what are the most important trade issues for APEC to address, and one of the top issues that came out was SME participation in global value chains. So really, you know, what has been done and what is changing. And so sort of number one is back in 2015 we set out this ambitious agenda to help MSMEs get involved in international trade 6 years ago, and we're going to hear an assessment of progress on that work. And now we have these sort of mega trade agreements, the RCEP and the CPTPP. They both have SME chapters. What can we expect from them? Well, we hear a lot about the promise of e-commerce and digital trade. It opens up global markets for MSMEs. What are the barriers to adopting e-commerce? And we heard some useful work from Usec and Lantayona on some initiatives from the DTA on that. And while during this COVID crisis, very few of us have been able to travel, and especially SMEs, they can't meet new clients. How has this changed the nature of SME business? And I hope that our panel of experts from around the region now will be able to shed light on the broader issues we're confronting and ensure that trade moving ahead is more inclusive. I think, as I see it, really we're trying to reconcile a dilemma that we face. We know that the indirect benefits of trade are enormous. It leads on average to lower costs of goods, better welfare, better wages, and so on. But we're trying to ensure that the future rules of trade directly benefit MSMEs. So each of our presenters will have up to 15 minutes. A warning will sound at 10 minutes, and then another will sound when time is up. And then our presentations will be followed by a 20-minute open discussion. My suggestion is that participants type their questions in the chat box when they occur to all of you. Our first presentation will be on the final review of the Boracay Action Agenda, Building Global MSMEs. This will be from Francis Mark Quimba and Sylwyn Calizo from the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. So over to you, Francis and Sylwyn.
Thank you, Sir Ed. Let me now just try to share my screen. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir.
All right, so our presentation, first let me acknowledge my colleague who has contributed very much to this research work. It's actually a research that's undertaken in collaboration with the Department of Trade and Industry, who has actually initiated the final review of the Boracay Action Agenda, building global MSMEs. I think it's important to start by asking the question, how important are MSMEs in APEC or in the region? MSMEs contribute four things to the economy. First, they are key employers. In fact, MSMEs employ approximately 73.8% of total employment throughout APEC. Second, MSMEs are important economic contributors, and depending on which economy, this can range from about 40 to 60% of the economy's total economic contribution. It is also worth noting that because of the large coverage of MSMEs becoming the link across sectors and industries, MSMEs growth tends to have a larger economic multiplier effect. Simply, they are a key source of revenue that drives economic growth. Third, MSMEs are definitely manifestations of entrepreneurship. MSME density in APEC is approximately 51 MSMEs per 1,000 people. MSME density is a measure of prevalence and an indicator of overall business environment, which in this case shows that MSMEs are definitely present throughout APEC, although some economies, especially Indonesia, with about 240 MSMEs per 1,000 population, has a lot more. Finally, MSMEs take the role of being a local community's backbone. In fact, MSMEs practically form the entirety of the number of total enterprises. And this is important because it means that MSMEs provide the needed employment, income generation, and even government revenue to the locality in which they operate. Throughout APEC, we know that MSMEs comprise about 99% of total enterprises. Now, before we probe deeper into MSMEs, let us first contextualize how APEC experienced COVID-19 pandemic thus far. Figure 1 shows that 29% of global reported cases are found in APEC, which is unsurprising because APEC is home to about 2.9 billion people, or about 38% of the global population in 2019. Taking a closer look at APEC, figure 2 shows us that most of the reported cases are from the United States, which reported 19% of global cases. They are followed by Russia, Mexico, Peru, Indonesia, Chile, Canada, and the Philippines, which all had at least 1% of the global reported cases. So these figures tell us that APEC was definitely not spared from the COVID-19 pandemic's impact, and MSMEs particularly are affected in the region, and this is shown in this slide. Based on surveys conducted by different researchers, that MSMEs throughout APEC were badly affected by the pandemic. Certain cases are shown in this slide. Some economies felt the impact stronger than others. For instance, 61% of Korean MSMEs felt the pandemic's impact, which is relatively lower than Japan's 92% or Canada's 81%. Another issue experienced in the region was a disruption in the supply chain. For example, about 70% of American and Korean MSMEs experienced some form of supply chain disruption, which is quite high compared to Japan's 39%. The loss of revenue or sales was also experienced in APEC. For instance, 41% of Australian MSMEs experienced at least a 50% drop in income within 2 months since COVID-19 started. This is similar to Canada's experience, where 78% of small businesses reported a 47% drop in sales. In Thailand, MSMEs had a darker outlook, where 90% expected an extreme revenue loss due to the pandemic. The pandemic did not spare workers either, and we can see that in the United States, where 52% of MSMEs laid off employees, while 34% halved the number of their staff members. Sadly, 43% of American MSMEs temporarily closed because of the pandemic, very much similar to the experience of the Philippines. Fortunately, APEC initiated the Boracay Action Agenda to globalize MSMEs in 2015. So even before the pandemic, the BAA has already been set in place, although we did not foresee that the pandemic will hit. And this can help MSMEs recover from any shock, especially the pandemic. Essentially, the BAA recognized that MSMEs are significant contributors to economic growth, trade, employment, poverty alleviation, and innovation, which means that their internationalization is key to realizing inclusive growth and development. So in order to internationalize MSMEs, the BAA identified priority actions that APEC could focus on from 2016 to 2020. And these priority actions include trade facilitation, financing, digital economy, institutional support, and women-led MSMEs. To talk about the BAA further, let me call on Sylwyn. Sylwyn, please.
Yes, thank you, Sir Francis. Sir, next slide, please. Okay, so let me start by saying that APEC has actively supported the realization of the BAA's goals, which, as Sir Francis has mentioned, is to strengthen MSME's capacity to internationalize. And our final assessment shows that the BAA is actually almost complete. In fact, out of the 132 BAA projects, 101 has already been completed as of June 8th. And this translates to a project completion rate of about 76.5%. We also found that APEC economies do recognize the importance of investing in MSMEs in the region. So for instance, APEC was able to invest a little more than 28 million US dollars, of which 44.7% are contributions coming from self-funded projects. We also found that APEC has provided an average funding of about 107,000 US dollars, and this was able to cover or support at least 55.9% of the average project value of these BAA projects. But we found that APEC has prioritized some priority actions more than others. So for instance, we found that 40.2% of BAA projects are actually related to institutional support. And this is followed by projects on the digital economy and women-led MSMEs. So unfortunately, we found that there is quite low or little collaboration. In fact, there were only 7.6% of BAA projects being proposed collaboratively by multiple economies. But we did find that APEC economies have supported quite a lot of these BAA projects. And the most supportive among them is actually Chinese Taipei, which was able to support 40.2% of these projects. And Chinese Taipei is followed by the Philippines, Korea, and Malaysia. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the key benefits of the BAA is actually found in the project learnings. And some BAA projects emerged in 2020 specifically to support MSMEs in overcoming the pandemic. Now, these BAA projects in 2020 are just quite a handful, but we've added here one example that came from a project about women-led MSMEs. So trade promotion organizations, and these are organizations that directly engage with female entrepreneurs and women-led MSMEs. They can help by mitigating structural and attitudinal barriers, promoting the adoption of best practices, and softening the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women-led MSMEs. Now, while this focuses more on helping women-led MSMEs, we do believe that these recommendations can still apply with the rest of the MSMEs. Next slide, please. Okay, so even though there were projects specifically for COVID-19, we can also still learn from BAA projects that came even before the pandemic started. And as Sir Francis mentioned, the BAA has been around since 2015. So here we've shown two groups. First is digitization, and the second is internationalization, which is about increasing the participation of MSMEs in global value chains. So let's start with digitization first. One learning is that we can promote MSMEs digitization and use of e-commerce. And this is very important because this serves as the gateway for MSMEs to be able to access the international market. So we are really glad to hear from Usec Lantayona earlier that DTI has actually made a lot of effort and projects about this. But it is also important that government should improve ICT and digital infrastructure in order to support MSMEs internationalization. Because without a reliable digital infrastructure, it would be really difficult for MSMEs to engage in the digital economy. And lastly, we can maximize MSMEs' use of fintech and digital financing platforms. And this is really important because a WTO paper published earlier this year has shown that MSME's trade finance proposals has actually been rejected 45% of the time. So these fintech and digital financing platforms can really help in liberalizing these MSMEs' access to uh, financial services. On internationalization, we can increase MSME's GVC participation by developing an efficient innovation system, linking MSMEs with lead firms, and improving the investment climate. Now, in a separate study done by Sir Francis and I, we found that restrictions to foreign equity do actually limit the foreign indirect investment coming into the country, and this can be a problem for engaging with the digital economy. Another thing is we could support policies that encourage MSMEs participation in services trade. And for example, we can review current strategies and policies in order to liberalize or open up the services trade sector. Lastly, we can promote strategies that can help MSMEs participate in GVCs through brand development or business continuity planning, among others. Next slide, please. Okay, so apart from the project learnings, the BAA has also provided or produced or identified a number of tools that can help MSMEs internationalize. Now, in this slide, we've shown some examples, but I won't elaborate on this too much. But I do invite you to look into this after the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so given all of the things that we've discussed, what can be our main takeaway? So we can say that MSMEs, they can utilize the BAA's accomplishments on digitization and internationalization in order to navigate through the new normal. Now, the BAA is a very rich resource of learnings that MSMEs can use in order to navigate this new normal, and it can also be used by governments in order to support this MSMEs recovery during and after the pandemic. Next slide, please. Okay, so that would be all for us, and we do welcome questions. We will entertain later. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Francis and Sylwyn. I see we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in. That's fantastic. Keep them coming. I don't know if our overall moderator wants to come in, or you want me to move straight on to the next presentation.
You can move straight on, sir.
Okay, so moving on, our next presentation is on the mega regionals. We're going to discuss the RCEP and the CPTPP, Asia Pacific's mega trade deals and their implications for SMEs. This will be from someone who's familiar to everyone, from Jenny Balboa, who's now with the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. So over to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ed Pedrosa. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'm delighted to be back to a beloved institution. I'm so excited to be back to a beloved institution, PIDS and PASCN, which was an important part of my life, and even in virtual capacity. And thank you very much, PIDS and PASCN, for inviting me to join these distinguished speakers and guests for today's activity, the joint PASCN UA&P Symposium. So my topic for this morning is RCEP and CPTPP and their implications on the small and medium enterprises. And my presentation will be divided into two parts. First, I would talk about the mega trade deals in Asia and the Pacific. And then I will briefly discuss their implications on SMEs in general. Yes, I'll be sharing my slide. So, okay, so let me just share with you my presentation. I hope this would work. Okay. All right. I hope you can see my presentation, my PowerPoint presentation. All right, thank you. So, okay, I have to wait a little bit because it's not working.
Hi, Miss Jenny. We can just flash it from our end.
Because it's taking quite a while for me to share this. Can you share the PDF file?
Oh, we can just share it from our end, ma'am.
All right, okay. So I'll just stop my slide share and sorry for that technical glitch. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let me. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the trends in FTAs then and now. Can you go on with the? Can you click the slides because there's animation? Okay, of course, this is common knowledge for many of you. In 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was established, and GATT was at the forefront of the US-led free trade strategy. 1995, WTO replaced GATT, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, incorporated the changes in the new globalized economy. However, by the year 2000s, the multilateral trade talks were suspended due to disagreements between developed and developing countries over issues. And so this prompted many members of the WTO to resort to bilateral and regional trade talks because these formats were ultimately easier to conclude, especially with countries sharing common agenda. And this gave rise to a new trend, which is the rise of or emergence of the new age FTAs or new age economic partnership agreements, which tackled issues not just on market access of goods and services or traditional trade issues, but beyond the border issues such as competition policy, transparency, government procurement, labor standards, small and medium enterprises. And right now, we're seeing a new trend, which is the rise of the mega FTAs. And in Asia and the Pacific alone, we see the rise of two mega FTAs, the RCEP and CPTPP. And both of these mega trade deals carry with them tremendous political and symbolic weight. And many scholars attribute this emergence of FTAs in Asia and the Pacific to the rivalry in leadership between US and China. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so what exactly is a mega FTA? And I guess the simple answer to that is it's an FTA composed of the biggest economies in the world, US, Japan, China, and EU. Because for an FTA to be qualified as a mega FTA, it should cover a large percentage of the world trade. It should have the presence of two or more parties that are considered regional hub. It is also usually trans-regional in geographic scope, and its concern is trade plus, similar to that of new age EPAs. So in other words, a mega FTA is much broader in scope and much deeper in content than bilateral FTAs. So next slide, please. Okay, so can you go on with clicking the slide? Okay, so brief history of RCEP and CPTPP, and I will not dwell on this because this is a story which is much familiar to you. So CPTPP was of course before Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was part and parcel of President Barack Obama's pivot to Asia strategy. And as we all know, in 2016, Donald Trump won the election, beating Hillary Clinton. And one of his first foreign policy action was to orchestrate the withdrawal of US from the TPP. And by January 2017, US was out of the TPP. And so taking over from the leadership vacuum left by the US, was Japan. Japan took over the leadership role of convening the remaining 11 members, and by 2018, the CPTPP was signed. RCEP, on the other hand, please click the next slide. Okay, was signed in, oh, not yet, please go back. RCEP was signed in 2020, and it is ASEAN-led with strong support from China. And with US out of the picture in the mega trade deals in Asia and the Pacific, RCEP effectively became the world's biggest mega FTA. Next slide, please. So RCEP is much bigger than CPTPP in all aspects. It comprises 29% of the world's output, 28% of the world's global trade, and covers almost a third of the world's population. Next slide, please. However, in terms of scope of the agreement and engagement of its members, CPTPP is much more extensive. And the left side table here compares the provisions of RCEP and CPTPP in the traditional trade issues, market access and goods, services, and investments. And more or less, you can see that in these chapters, they are comparable in these contents. However, CPTPP and RCEP vastly differ in terms of issues pertaining to beyond the border issues. So CPTPP has provisions on labor standards, state-owned enterprises, corporate governance, environment, transparency, regulatory cooperation. These are chapters which RCEP is not devoted RCEP is not devoted special chapters regarding this issue. And I think this difference reflects the distinction of these mega trade deals in principles and goals. Nonetheless, what these two mega FTAs have in common is their dedication to small and medium enterprises. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the SME provisions in RCEP and CPTPP. And as you can see here, both mega trade deals are concerned with information sharing and cooperation in various aspects of the business, such as e-commerce, IPR, market access, etc. However, I believe CPTPP has more details on how to proceed with this cooperation. For example, CPTPP mandates the creation of an SME committee and monitoring mechanisms. And for me, this is an indication of the seriousness of the CPTPP to effectively connect with the small and medium enterprises. So next slide, please. So in this table, this table summarizes the more or less the other chapters other than the SME chapter that help or tackle SMEs. And RCEP and CPTPP both have chapters devoted to elimination or reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers, which can help in cost reduction of imported products and capital goods needed in business and operations. Both agreements also have chapters on e-commerce, which are very important in helping SMEs in more efficient operation, of course, reducing their cost of operation, business also, increasing their customers or expanding it to much global, have global reach, and acquire consumer confidence in digital trade. And both agreements also have chapters meant to expand opportunities for SMEs. For example, RCEP and CPTPP have chapters enhancing participation in government procurement activities. And CPTPP in particular has a chapter which aim to reduce competition of the state-owned enterprises. So next slide, please. Right, so I reached my 10 minutes. So anyway, why are SMEs, why do SMEs matter for mega trade deals? And this has been mentioned repeatedly by our speakers and highlighted by previous speakers. SMEs are very important in the economic activities of Asia and the Pacific because they comprise 90% of or more of the firms in the region. They provide up to 60-70% of employment and more than 50% of production in many countries. So in other words, if a mega trade deal wants to genuinely make a difference in its members' growth and development, it should be able to effectively link and meaningfully link with their small and medium enterprises. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the benefits of a mega trade deal for the SMEs? Next slide, please. And of course, as I mentioned, mega trade deals create a lot of opportunities for SMEs, and among them, and this has been mentioned previously, market access to a number of countries, including developed countries, and cost reduction, of course, due to access to cheaper imported inputs and capital goods from partner countries. And SMEs can take advantage of these to reduce cost of production and business costs. Also, these mega trade deals can provide stable rules that can provide predictability and stability as to the rules for the countries trading in goods and services. And this can also enable SMEs to improve their financial and budget planning for long-term growth. Of course, they can provide new business opportunities because of access to new and cheaper imports and even more competitive exports. And finally, these mega trade deals have a huge potential to help facilitate participation of SMEs in the global value chain due to their trade facilitation measures to help these SMEs overcome the barriers to trade and help them connect with multinational corporations and international partners. So next slide, please. All right. So in conclusion, I don't have so much time. So mega trade deals are important to sustain open global trade, reduce the trade costs, and institutionalize the framework for cooperation among countries in Asia and the Pacific. And this is very important in light of we have to admit, uncertainty in the multilateral diplomacy and the threat of rising protectionism in the post-COVID world. These mega trade deals are also very important to SMEs, as discussed in the previous slides, and can provide great opportunities that are needed in the post-COVID recovery. And finally, this is an issue that has been discussed by in many circles. Considering the volatile political and economic environment that we're facing, there are a lot of uncertainties to the future of these mega trade deals. So what's going to be the future? Is it more competition or consolidation? But in reality, how things will turn out really depends on the global political climate, such as whether the US under President Biden will decide to renegotiate or rejoin CPTPP. So that's going to be a game changer. But anyway, I'm hoping that a pathway towards consolidation can be created, because creating this one unified mega FTA can eliminate the noodle bowl effect or the confusing rules, which are a nightmare for SMEs to comply. And dealing with only one mega FTA could mean simpler rules to make these free trade agreements or mega FTAs more accessible, understandable, and useful to the small and medium enterprises. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much. And I think if I was going to summarize that, the mega regionals can provide more certainty in an era of great uncertainty and reduce trade costs for SMEs. But there's a lot to do, I think, in terms of implementation. And now moving on, we're gonna hear about facilitating e-commerce in Malaysia. How do we get SMEs to onboard, I guess, in the e-commerce space? And what we'll hear from Dr. Andrew Kam, who's an associate professor at the University Kebangsaan, Malaysia. I think this is a joint paper that he wrote with Dr. Tan Shu Yin from the Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. Over to you, Andrew.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'd like to share my slide, if it's possible. Okay. Can everyone see the slide? Just double check.
It's coming. Just give it a
All
second.
right. Okay.
We can see it now, Dr. Andrew.
All right. A very good morning to everyone. Greetings to everyone in the land of good food, great singers, and of course, brilliant scholars. It is always a pleasure to be among friends, and I would like to thank the organizer for the invitation. Today, I'm going to present a paper that I've written with Professor Tham Suyuan, who unfortunately couldn't be with us here today. Yes, so first of all, I'm sure everyone have at least seen an illustration here or two during this COVID pandemic. The most famous one will be on your right side, but you get the gist of it. Digital transformation is somewhat the go-to tagline during this COVID because of many of the movement control measures by the government. Now, in short, businesses have to move to e-commerce and they have to move very fast. Even before the COVID, the cost reduction benefits of e-commerce adoption are well recognized. E-commerce can reduce the transaction cost through buyer-seller coordination, reduce the need for middlemen, and most importantly, and I think everybody can relate to this, is removing the need to be physically present to conduct transaction, be it in the local or export markets. Of course, there are many more benefits, but I'm not going to cover here. Therefore, benefits can be on the supply side or the demand side. Unfortunately, like the picture earlier I showed you of the wrecking ball, many MSMEs have yet to harness the benefits of e-commerce. In a study by SME Corp Malaysia and Huawei Tech in 2018, 1/3 of SMEs are reluctant to use e-commerce because they feel that they already have their own supplier and demand market built on traditional brick and mortar methods. So more numbers here showing how far our SMEs are from adopting e-commerce actually come from the Department of Statistics Census in 2016. While more than 50% of SME users computer and the internet, only 20% of them have web presence in their businesses, and abysmal 4.8% were involved in e-commerce transactions. So the numbers are actually quite low. This paper therefore aims to empirically examine the barriers of e-commerce adoption in Malaysia and explore the key post-adoption benefits. One caveat is that this research was done before COVID, but I believe the challenges still persist because digital transformation is a long-term plan. COVID, however, may have expedited some of the digital transformation process, and of course, provided if the businesses are still alive. So first of all, we need to justify why do we look at SMEs and why we focus on the retail and F&B services in Malaysia. Well, the numbers are relevant. 98.5 businesses in Malaysia are SMEs, and they represent almost 66% of Malaysia's total employment and 40% of the GDP with 17% of international markets. We focus on the F&B because it is the fastest growing sector in Malaysia for SMEs, nearing 8% in 2017. So hence it warrants our attention to look into this area. We did some digging on the literature and found various studies dated decades ago explaining technology adoption, which in current terms include e-commerce adoption. We went through many theories, the theory of acceptance model, which is 1989, planned behavior, unified theory, and the use of technology. Of course, no models are perfect. We need to adapt or extend the models. But at the end of the day, we settled down with 4 key variables of interest, which are augmented from the TOE model, which is first, we focus on decision makers. Second, we focus on technological barriers, and then organization barriers, and finally, environmental barriers. So these are the 4 key themes or 4 key variables that we will look at in our research. We designed a questionnaire based on the framework and presented before stakeholders such as the Malaysia E-Commerce Association to verify the questionnaire. We make sure to define our working definition that e-commerce transaction is the sale or purchase of goods or services conducted over computer networks by methods specifically designed for the purpose of receiving or placing order. It is important because we want to make sure that phone calls, fax, or manually typed emails are not being considered in this category. Then we did a pilot study and conducted various diagnostic tests. We conducted a full survey. The Malaysia External Trade Development Corporation, MATRADE, SME Association of Malaysia, and the Malaysia Retailers Association also participated in this 9-month survey where we used purposive sampling techniques. We did face-to-face interviews also after we found the result just to verify them. So I'm going to present our findings, and we found out that digital transformation itself is not all about technology. Based on our survey of a total 204 respondents across micro, small, and medium enterprises, we only request the CEO or managers or owners to be the respondent in this survey. And we have 53% of the respondents are e-commerce adopters, and 47 who are non-adopters. So it's quite balanced. Based on the respondents' result, they are mostly micro enterprises, so sales revenue are below 300,000 ringgit, which is lesser than $100,000, and half of them are slightly below 8 years in operation, so they're quite young. First, we analyze within adopters and non-adopters. Ranking in orders of importance, e-commerce users and non-users agree that senior managements play an important role in digital transformation, followed by organization factors. So this is the first few of the data that we have. And then we check if the response from adopters and non-adopters are statistically different. So first, on technological barriers, we found that non-adopters and adopters have not much differences in their opinion. The only main difference comes from technological infrastructure. Maybe perhaps adopters may already be aware of the technological challenges and may already take action to overcome them. Hence, they view the barrier differently compared to non-adopters. Response to organization barriers show that they are quite statistically different if you look at the means that it is shown here. Almost all non-adopters have values that are higher than 3. The Likert scale is from 1 to 5. So if it's more than 3, in other words, they find that it is an important barrier. So it seems like non-adopters are facing more organization barriers, firm size issues, financial issues, compared to adopters. I think the financial issues and human resource issues seems to be the main or the strongest barrier for non-adopters. And if we look at the environmental factor, the response between adopter and non-adopters are also quite different. Barriers such as government incentives, additional costs to create e-payment system actually stood out in our study. Both CEOs of adopters and non-adopters agreed they're actually still learning about e-commerce transaction, which is good. The only thing is they are unsure whether the benefits of e-commerce surpasses the cost that they put into it. And also, they are actually quite worried about how to manage all the new technology coming up. So we further our study to create an empirical model on the impact of barriers on e-commerce. We run the data through various diagnostic tests using the principal component analysis, PCA, and we found out that the key component variables, the key variables can be further broken down. Remember earlier I said that we have these 4 themes, and after running the PCA, these 4 themes actually been broken down into further or finer categories. So while maintaining the 4 themes, technological barrier now can be separated into infrastructural and also security concerns, while environmental barriers are further categorized into government support and market barriers and structure. Okay. Model specification is as follows. We identify our questionnaire using dummy variables, 1 for adopter, 0 for non-adopter. We put the variables and control for firm characteristics such as age, CEO age, size, organization age, and industrial dummy. So since it is a binary dependent variable, we use a logic regression with a robust estimator, and we ran on 3 models. First, the overall model, then a model with disaggregated barriers, and finally, we ran it based on the full or based on different SME sizes. And the result shows that, I'll only interpret the significant results and the magnitude because of time. First, the significant variables are age of CEO, whereby younger CEO are more likely to adopt e-commerce. But the larger the firm, the more likely e-commerce will be adopted. Organization barriers are significant in the overall, while environment barriers are also significant, but only the market-oriented ones. So for example, barriers such as high additional cost of e-payments, those are the significant variables. We proceed to model 2, and as explained, we only choose the barriers that are significant to model 1, and we break them down into smaller. So model 2 shows that CEO also matters, implying this result is both it is robust in model 1 and 2. For organization barriers, firm size and the lack of technical knowledge and training are strong or significant barriers, while financial constraint and human capitals are also important, but at the lesser extent. So human capital side is actually much more important than the financial side to some extent. As for environmental barrier, overcoming market competition is important to ensure the e-commerce will be able to adopt, SMEs will be able to adopt the e-commerce. We run using separate firm size, but we can only do it for micro and small because we do not have enough observation for medium size. In general, micro firm focuses more on organization barriers, while small firms, they are more worried about technology and market environment matters. So the next step is to ask ourselves what to do with all this information that we have. But before that, our survey also tried to identify the benefits or the perceived benefits, because some of them are non-adopters, from using e-commerce. So the top 3 are shown as above. So both adopters and non-adopters have similar sentiments about benefits of e-commerce. Most perceive the benefits are tied to productivity. But if we look into, or if we separate from micro to small firms, macro firms focuses more on the branding and exposure side, while small firms, they feel that the management efficiency in generating sales and the domestic market shares are the important benefits of e-commerce adoption. An important issue stood out is that the relationship between e-commerce adoption and export is weak in comparison to other factors. So in conclusion, CEO decision is important in adoption of e-commerce. Therefore, the policy suggestion can be any upcoming training programs should target only key decision makers, not the representative of CEOs, which we usually find in many of the government training seminars. So finding also shows that younger CEO are more likely to adopt e-commerce. Therefore, assistance should be focused on the young CEO and startups. We also found organization barriers to be significant. Hence, policies that help these enterprises to overcome financial or human constraints are important. In particular, policies that increase technical knowledge may assist them in solving human resource constraints, while financial incentives may help them to overcome their firm capacity or size issue. Market-related environmental barriers are also important, so facilitating them in terms of technical transition, physical investment, hardware is important, but we also should include programs to sustain their sales in e-commerce, to harness repeated sales such as branding, digital marketing, and utilizing big data for market intelligence and so forth. This applies to both micro and small firms. And finally, firm size and e-commerce adoption should be considered together in policy making. So technological barriers are not always the most important barrier. And micro and small enterprises, regardless they are adopters or not, they perceive more of the benefits on the domestic market, indicating there is less focus on the use of e-commerce to penetrate export markets. And therefore, policies that assist the transaction of non-exporter to an exporters are critical. So in Malaysia, how did we actually fare or use this information? So I think my time is up. Anyway, it's conclusion anyway. So thank you so much. And back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. That's fascinating. If any of you have ever tried to trawl through the data in the Network Readiness Index, you'll see for example, data on the number of firms with a website, and you'll understand how valuable this kind of work from Andrew is. Not a lot of firms in our economies actually have websites, and you'll just understand what a challenge it is to onboard. Now, you'll also see data that says during the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of our companies have had to onboard very quickly. So just understanding what the barriers are to digital adoption are critical, and what makes a successful policy are absolutely critical. So thank you very much, Andrew, for that kind of work. That's absolutely critical. So moving on very, very quickly, because we are running out of time, is to what has been the impact of COVID-19 on SME international relationships. So we're going to hear from someone from the APEC host economy, Benjamin Philippe Fath from the University of Auckland Business School. Benjamin, over to you. Thank you, Benjamin.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the kind opportunity to share part of our research as part of the symposium. I'm now I've been enabled to share my screen, so I'm just going to do this in a second. Yes, so my name is Benjamin Fath, and I'm with the University of Auckland Business School. We have done some research on New Zealand exporters, especially SME exporters, and how they have dealt with the COVID-19 crisis. And what I want to do today is basically just three things. I want to talk about the paper a little bit, but I also want to talk a bit about the context. And then finally, I want to spend some time on what it means, because normally when I write these papers, I get very little opportunity to really think about what does it actually mean. So what is the real things that are not in the paper? And that's what I would also like to share as part of the symposium. So New Zealand, I want to summarize New Zealand for those of you who don't know where we are with one small statement, and that is New Zealand is a small, open, remote, developed economy that has, in brackets, a mostly developing country export profile. So what does this mean? If you look at the slide, I got this from the New Zealand Treasury. It basically means that New Zealand is far far away from the action. So when it comes to global trade, we are not a hub. We are better conceptualized as the final bus stop, so to speak. So whenever our businesses trade, they do not only trade across borders, they trade literally overseas. So basically, if you have a 3.5-hour flight from New Zealand, you would probably just cover about 1% of world GDP. If you would look at this in your regions, you'll probably get much higher percentages. So in terms of our export profile, New Zealand developing country profile, what do I mean by this? We mostly export things that are commoditized, mostly food. Increasingly, this is changing. And we are mainly importing more sophisticated products, such as cars and computers. Our health response has been somewhat of a success, and this is to COVID-19, and this is from actually a fairly weak starting position, if you trust the OECD. So again, at the slide, I put one visualization by the OECD that looked at the number of ICU beds in the OECD countries, and New Zealand actually was, as a starting point, at a fairly weak position, having only about a quarter of the ICU beds of the OECD average. So when you think of this, New Zealand kind of started from a position of being a small island, health system probably not very well prepared for a global pandemic relative to other OECD countries. But in that context has actually done fairly well. How have we done this? Well, distance has been not only the defining feature of New Zealand's trade, but it's also the defining feature of New Zealand's response to COVID-19, in that we went into lockdown fairly early on. It has really been a lockdown that has not been heavily enforced through a heavy-handed government, but by a focus on empathy and kindness. So trying to stamp out or eliminate the community transmission of COVID-19 has become the right thing to do. And people got behind it because they felt it was actually something that the country can do really well in. So it has become a competitive sort of pursuit. And as a result, New Zealand has done probably better than most liberal market economies if you compare us to Australia or Europe or the US, so countries we like to compare ourselves to. We've done fairly well, both in terms of the health response as well as the economic response. Unemployment is very low, it's around the 5% mark. New Zealand has been doing really, really well. So our study was mainly focused on how have exporters been hit by COVID-19, especially in the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, when New Zealand went into very, very hard lockdown very, very early on, trying to stamp out the virus from our shores. So what we see is when we look at the literature, and I only have one of those slides, so apologies for the wordiness. The background in the literature is when you trade across borders, SMEs normally have a problem. Basically have two problems. First, they don't know anything, so they have a lack of knowledge about foreign markets. And they also often don't know anyone, which basically means they have a FISA liability of outsidership in trying to get into networks in foreign countries, which then enable them to learn about those markets. So the basic question that arises from this is, how tight do you want to become with your networks? Because there's basically two views in the broader literature. You can say that you want to be very tight, you want to have a tight network, you want to have very strong ties to your network partners, and that tends to be good for learning, so you get more especially specific tested knowledge about markets when you know your in-market partners really well. But at the same time, this close relationship might also blind you. It might blind you to new opportunities, or it may actually expose you to opportunism because you overtrust. I myself, with my colleagues, we have written critically about this. That SMEs, when they internationalize, can become a little bit too naive in building those international networks. And then there's an argument that weak ties can be good because they give you a wider range of knowledge that you can have access to. But at the same time, the downside of weak ties might be that during times of crisis, they may break. So it's a bit of a paradox, and that is, how strong do you want your networks to build? There are pros and cons of having strong networks in your foreign markets, as well as there are pros and cons in having weak networks within the markets you're aiming in. So on that basis, we basically looked at a couple of exporters, 14 to be precise, and we interviewed them at the onset of the crisis, where basically travel had become a non-existent luxury for them, and they had to start developing those or maintaining those business ties with their international partners via digital means. And so that was basically the whole crux of the study that we've conducted. And we basically ended up with 4 situations that we did observe. And some of them were actually quite surprising to me, so I want to go through them fairly quickly. Because when you put this on a 2x2, and this is what people in a business school do very well, putting things into 2x2s, you would basically see that there are weak pre-COVID relationships and strong pre-COVID relationships, and you could have a positive market outlook. So you're in an industry that actually, in inverted commas, benefited from COVID-19, such as health food, pet food, all these sorts of things that people started spending a bit more money on. Or you might have a negative outlook, tourism, events, like industries that were really, really heavily impacted by COVID-19. And when we asked those exporters operating in those industries, what we found, obviously, negative outlook and weak pre-COVID relationship. The relationship broke down, the business basically declined, and in many cases, there was no chance of recovering this business. And also, if you're very strong, so it's the first quadrant. The fourth quadrant is, as in all consulting businesses, the top quadrant. So if you had very strong pre-COVID relationships and your industry was going strong, then you were growing market share. And that was to the extent that people would actually forgo business with potential other partners, and you would benefit from it. So having that strong relationship was actually quite beneficial, even if all lines were pointing up. But then the other two quadrants, quadrant 2 and 3, were a little bit more surprising. So if you had a weak pre-COVID relationship and you had a positive outlook, we thought, well, actually that wouldn't make a problem. That wouldn't be a problem because you would be able to grow with the industry. But what the data had actually shown us was that people that were in favorable industries struggled when they only had weak relationships within those countries, particularly because in those countries, people would start to focus on their strong relationships at the expense of weak relationships. So if you don't have a very strong in-country partner that you can trust and that you can rely on, even if the industry grows during times of crisis, you may be dropping to the bottom of the heap and people stop doing, well, don't necessarily stop doing business with you, but you're not a priority. So people tend to prioritize those relationships in times of crisis. And the third quadrant, so if you had, that was the most surprising to us, you had a pre-COVID relationship was quite strong and your market outlook was negative. What we had learned from this quadrant was that because of those strong relationships, people were actually encouraged to take advantage of new opportunities that would emerge in those markets. So one example that we had, a tangible example, we had a company that was doing boxes for events. They pivoted into desks that would enable people to work better from home. And that was basically all built on the strong relationship that they had. So that's kind of the empirical sort of observations that we made. What do those empirical observations mean? Well, there is a strong reliance on personal relationships as small firms internationalize. This is very well known. And it's a bit of a coin with two sides. You know, having strong relationships is good when it works, as long as it does. When it stops working, people normally get into trouble. And as I said earlier, we have written critically about this, that businesses shouldn't overexpose themselves to the risk of effective trust, or that effective trust can bring risks with it that people should be wary of. But I think in the times of crisis, we were surprised how important those strong relationships actually were. And there's an important lesson for most firms doing business internationally in this, in that do not underestimate the strengths of strong relationships when it comes to crisis. Another important learning that we had was it's very difficult to turn a weak relationship into a strong relationship during crisis. And we thought, oh, as companies would go through crisis together, there would be an opportunity to strengthen the relationship. But we didn't really see much of that happening, because what normally happens when the crisis hit, people and businesses would focus on the strong relationships that they do have and had very little interest in turning a weak relationship that was more transactional into a more personal sort of relationship over time. So for us, it basically has really shown the power of those strong relationships in international business for SMEs more than we would have anticipated. And I think there's a couple of learnings from not only the New Zealand perspective, but in general that can be taken away from this. And that is, now we're talking about a stronger move towards digital and how digital reduces many of the costs associated with doing business internationally. In the light of the data that we have collected, I wouldn't be so sure about this. I think it would still remain an expensive exercise for many small firms to build those strong relationships so that they can rely on them when things tend to go wrong. And so for us, that has really been one of the things that has stuck with us. So that's basically part of the New Zealand story that I was invited to share today. And I hope that at least some of those things will stick and that they will prove useful. So with that, I pass it back to you, Eduardo.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. That's very helpful to put the sort of the impact of COVID on MSMEs in a context and the importance of having strong relationships with your clients. We are really tight on time, so I've been in the background negotiating with our hosts so we can answer some of the questions, at least from our audience. So I've been allowed to pose one question per presentation. So let me begin with Francis and Sylwyn. We had some really interesting and I think important questions, I think related to something that's really critical on the financing for MSMEs that I think is on everyone's minds. And I think in your presentation, you really pointed out that this was one pillar of the Boracay Action Agenda that didn't quite get as much attention from the projects that were proposed. So let me really ask this to you, and I'll ask all the questions in one go and let you answer them all. You know, cash flow has been really difficult during COVID. You know, shops have been closed down. Everything. What can we do? You mentioned, I think, you know, the possibility of fintech, but what can be done to help firms rebuild capital? What can we do? Is this fintech the answer? Is there something that can be done? Jenny, people are worried. Let's not kid ourselves here. There is a backlash. There's a reason why people are worried about globalization. What kind of impact will these mega FTAs have on MSMEs? Are we unnecessarily worried, or are there going to be opportunities for MSMEs to go overseas? Are there opportunities for us, or will there be net gains for our societies with these mega regionals? What's the net benefit for our societies with these mega regionals? What can we look forward to as they get implemented? Let's just be honest with ourselves here. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? What are the net benefits? Let's put it all on the table. Andrew, you know what? One thing, you know, you're going out directly onto the internet's difficult, but can we use these platforms? What can we do? You know, what opportunities are on the platforms to intermediate trade? Are there risks? How do we define platforms? Are you still with us? I wasn't quite sure. Ben, can we extrapolate from there some more? What can we do? Is there a portfolio approach for MSMEs to manage relationships with different markets? Can we do something to risk manage in this era? What can we be doing? What can we be recommending for them? That's it. We've got, I don't know, 6 minutes left. Go, Francis and Sylwyn.
Yes, very quickly. I think it's really the issue is cash flow, and I think what the government has done is really to bite the bullet. You know, provide the necessary cash, provide the necessary incentives and aid to the MSMEs, with the condition that they would continue employing, that they would still pursue operations once the restrictions have been lifted. Because, you know, as I've mentioned earlier, the multiplier effects from having the MSMEs continue operation would, in a way, result into more gains from the investment that you would give them as aid. Thank you.
Great. I'll just go on, Sylwyn, please.
Sure. If I may just add to what Sir Francis has mentioned, I think the government could also provide awareness programs about possible options for financing, because the earlier WTO paper that I mentioned, one of the factors that limit MSMEs from funding is the lack of awareness. So I think having awareness programs is something the government could provide to these MSMEs. Thank you.
Thanks. I think you're right to raise that paper. I think they ask us to imagine a world in which Apple computers didn't get the $15,000 in financing they needed to buy parts. So that's a great image to have in your minds. And they say that there's a $1.5 trillion gap in trade financing, and they do identify some of the issues. And so, you know, it's really worth looking at our whole banking system, the difficulties with the Basel implementation, the KYC, AML issues that we have, and how can we build that capacity to make sure that our small companies, our MSMEs, can get the financing they need. Because, you know, I think they identified that the rejection rate for MSME proposals for trade finance is 45% on average around the world. That's not going to lead to a great situation that we have. Over to you, Jenny. You're on mute, I think.
I'm muted. Okay, sorry. Yes, I agree that there are risks involved in opening the economy, and these risks especially hit hard the vulnerable sectors or the sectors that are not competitive. This entails adjustment costs. However, for me, the advantage is clearer, and in the Philippines alone, it's very apparent. These mega trade deals could help diversify the trade partners of the Philippines, lessen its trade dependence on China, and extend its supply chain. The recent geopolitical events is very clear about this. The tensions in the West Philippine Sea included showed us that the Philippines, if it's prudent, should not put all its eggs in one Chinese basket. So it's for the diversification of trade partners.
Okay, thanks. Andrew, platforms, opportunities to use them. Are there risks involved? Do we understand how they work? You're on mute, Andrew.
All right. Yes, there are risks, but just let me share with you what Malaysia government have done during this COVID and how the paper actually is relevant to it. First, to overcome technological barriers, the government actually increased accessibility to digital platforms. We gave them 1 gigabyte per day free from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. from mid-June to December 2020. So we also increased the usability of the digital platforms. Government give tax exemption for employees in ICT services and other various benefits as well. And as for overcoming organization barriers, we have all these new flexible working arrangements, and we have also employment injury schemes as well for those who are working at home. Yes, we also promote new forms of market. So under our digital program, so Global Online Workforce is actually also a new platform that we use to train Malaysia to try to earn income from international clients. Other various sort of platforms to use, not only on the marketplace, especially in Malaysia, we have this thing called Shop Malaysia Online, or Buy Malaysia campaigns as well. So, and of course, with a platform, we need a lot of transactional activities. So we have to revitalize the marketplace and the payment system as well. Government has given everyone some e-credits, through some of the applications that the government have actually given everyone. So I would say that, the digital platform has been used for policy dissemination during COVID-19. Of course, sorry if I missed the question you asked about the risk, is it, Eduardo?
Yep.
Yeah, so the risk, yes, everybody was afraid at first, even including my father. He doesn't believe that the government is giving free. I have to sit down and I have to key in for him how to do it. And at the end, when you see money in your phone, then you say, oh, wow, this is so nice. And you can actually buy things. So the risk, I would say, is always there. Of course, the government tries to mitigate it. And, we have all these security issues, on our Zoom as well. So I would say it is there, but the only thing is how do you actually make the people trust all this, and how do you use that as a tool? Yeah,
I think that's a key word, isn't it? Trust in these systems.
Exactly. And just want to add one more thing. Sorry, Connie, I'll reply you later. Connie, because she asked some question about women, and Zandro, you asked about how do you say whether we have considered them the R&D. Yes, we have. Perhaps Zandro, you send me your email personally, PM, and I will send you the paper. It'll be easier that way.
Okay, Ben, I think you've got 1 minute because I'm being hushed up.
I probably need 30 seconds, given that this is not my main area of expertise. Online is very expensive for small firms. I think domestically it's a possibility, but cross-border, it's probably something those firms have to do collectively. And I think that's probably an area where the government can become a bit more active also. And New Zealand has tried to do so, but it's a long, long game.
Okay, we don't have much time for a summary. All I can do is thank my panelists and say that this is a time of great opportunity and there's lots of work to be done. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our presenters and to Dr. Pedrosa for that very engaging and lively discussion. Perhaps for those who have been asking questions in the chat box, may I suggest to the speakers that they can probably answer them privately so that the conversation can continue on. So now we move on to our second session. This second session features research work on Philippine MSMEs undertaken by experts from PASCN member institutions to facilitate exchange of information and possible future collaborative research. Our moderator is Dr. Gloria Futalan, Dean of College of Business Administration and coordinator of the Master in Business Administration of Silliman University. She is also the chair of the board of the Philippine Federation of Credit Cooperatives, or PFCCO. Dr. Futalan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Beng. Good morning, distinguished guests, friends. Navigating the new normal is indeed one big global challenge for all of us today. For session 2, we will be listening to the presentation of research works on the Philippines MSMEs undertaken by experts from the Philippine APEC Study Center Network member institutions. Let us prepare for a robust exchange of information. But before I introduce our speakers, and due to time constraints, as already mentioned by Bing, let me just reiterate that our speakers at the end of their presentation can respond to the questions on the chat box. Let me now introduce the first presenter. He is a holder of a Doctor of Philosophy in Economics from De La Salle University, Manila, and a visiting research fellow of Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Beppo, Japan, here to present his research findings on enhancing external participation of Philippine MSMEs towards entrepreneurial venture growth. Let us welcome Dr. John Paulo Rivera, an adjunct faculty at the AIM and the Associate Director of the AIM Dr. Andrew L. Tan Center for Tourism. Dr. Rivera.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope my screen is ready and my audio is clear. So thank you very much for the introduction, and I am very happy to see everyone. And I am grateful to the PIDS, the PASCN, and the University of Asia and the Pacific for having me in this symposium. So this is another excellent opportunity for everyone to catch up on our respective research in the field of MSMEs, particularly on the topic of bootstrapping these MSMEs towards recovery from the pandemic towards greater viability in the better normal. I actually prefer I prefer calling it better normal than new normal, because we cannot be carrying everything from the old normal, particularly business models that were rendered by the pandemic obsolete, to the new era. Anyway, so before I begin, some acknowledgements. So the contents of my presentation this morning was culled from the study that I conducted with Dr. Brian Gozun from De La Salle University, titled Determinants of Entrepreneurial Venture Growth in the Philippines, using the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. So the studies was supported by the DLSU Angelo King Institute for Economic and Business Studies under the research grant on entrepreneurship and family studies. And an accompanying policy brief was published by ACI as well last February 2021, whose contents I'm about to present to you or to share with you. And likewise, you may also access both the full study or the discussion paper and the policy brief through the DLSU Angelo King Institute and CERP websites. So this is the outline of my presentation, and in the succeeding slides, I will be highlighting the construct external participation, and I'll do my best to stick to the time limit. Now, this study has a two-pronged motivation or significance, if you may want to call it like that, namely a knowledge component and policy component. For the knowledge component, while there is an abundance of studies on the various facets of entrepreneurship, there seems to be a gap as far as localized studies are concerned. That's one. And one of which is the topic on entrepreneurial venture growth explained using the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Hence, beyond contributing to localized studies on Philippine entrepreneurship, This study can also serve as a proof of concept of the usefulness of the Philippine Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Adult Population Survey in conducting empirical research in entrepreneurship. In terms of policy component, in a post-pandemic world, also known as a better normal, it is imperative for us to explore the feasibility of harnessing external presence to grow an enterprise. So we can do better in facilitating external participation for Philippine MSMEs than before. And this is because of the fact that MSMEs will continue to comprise approximately 99% of the total establishments in the Philippines that's still characterized to be fragmented, diverse across sectors and industries and markets. Now, some key definitions that we use in the study. So we subscribe to the following definitions of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial venture growth, and external participation. We follow GEM's definition of entrepreneurship as any attempt of an organization or venture creation to expand an existing business by an individual, a team, or individual established business. Meanwhile, entrepreneurial venture growth, so we combine two definitions to go as the rate at which enterprises expand to the next level in terms of workforce, customers, revenues, liquidity, profits, geographical locations, and a variety of other dimensions. And finally, external participation, as per the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, is the degree of exposure or participation in the foreign market represented in the GEM APS through two variables, namely international orientation, which is measured by the share of foreign customers in output, and export orientation, which is measured by the proportion of output for exports. And in surveying the literature, we can fundamentally group the factors driving entrepreneurial venture growth into founder characteristics, firm attributes, and entrepreneurial strategies, together with all the other factors that may drive entrepreneurial venture growth. Now, in the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, entrepreneurial strategies, as you can see from the figure on your screen, entrepreneurial strategies is comprised of market expansion strategies represented by latent variables that includes continuous innovation, finding new markets, adapting new technologies, engaging in an appropriate degree of competition. And other than market expansion, it is also comprised of external participation strategies, namely international orientation and export orientation. So while the literature suggested that founder characteristics, firm attributes, and entrepreneurial strategies drive venture growth, we asked the question, how will this relationship be depicted from the Philippine GEM APS? Are we going to find certain peculiarities? And that inquiry guided the research design of this study. And from our empirical approach, specifically a generalized method of moments approach, whose details are documented in the discussion paper, so we found that founder characteristics and firm attributes, we found it to be inadequate predictors of entrepreneurial venture growth as opposed to what literature has established. Meanwhile, on entrepreneurial strategies consistent with literature, we found that market expansion strategies are significant predictors of venture growth. Likewise, and this is interesting, external participation strategies are also significant. However, between market expansion and external participation strategies, the latter demonstrated greater magnitude and significance in driving venture growth. So, however, we need to explain why the demographic factors were deemed to be inadequate. So, to explain it, we introduced interaction effects and found that entrepreneurial strategies, both market expansion and external participation, were moderated by founder characteristics and firm attributes. So, why focus on external participation? So, from our empirical results, we saw this as an opportunity to highlight a value chain approach to entrepreneurial venture growth. So to fully harness the accelerator effect, the spillover effects, the multiplier effects, or the leverage, whatever you may want to call it, of implementing an intervention, entrepreneurs may want to explore the opportunities of shifting from a firm-centric to a value chain approach in pursuing entrepreneurial venture growth. Now, there was a question earlier on reinventing MSMEs towards resilience. So one answer to that might be, rather than focusing on reinventing oneself, is actually reinventing the value chain. And as such, given the necessary sufficient conditions, pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, facilitating factors and constraints for MSMEs to engage in external participation, we are able to open the discussion on what can both entrepreneurs and government do. For entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs may want to consider the following. Of course, this is still on a case-to-case basis. So rather than venturing into direct exportation, such as the production of final goods for exports, which most of the time proves to be very challenging due to lack of economies of scales and scope, MSMEs possessing niche specialization and technologies can be a supplier of raw materials or work in progress to larger enterprises who already have access to the global value chain. Now, second, enterprises that produce finished products can develop their own value chain by outsourcing from foreign suppliers and taking advantage of relatively lower costs, with greater flexibility to market forces. And third, go digital to normalize peer-to-peer connections and take advantage. Entrepreneurs need to take advantage of government-sponsored capacity building and mentoring programs, which Usec has emphasized earlier during her speech. So here, we highlight that the productive capacity to participate in the international market is just a necessary condition of external participation. The sufficiency condition may indicate that access to global value chains is critical. And in correspondence with our recommendations for entrepreneurs, it can be matched with corresponding recommendations authorities may continue developing, such as providing technical assistance towards establishing both forward and backward linkages, particularly with large enterprises that are already linked with the global value chain. Providing capacity building and mentoring programs, both financial and non-financial support for those MSMEs who can produce higher value products that for all MSMEs so that they can participate in the international market. Government can also contribute significantly to marketing efforts through the reduction or subsidization of participation costs and accelerate the digitization of platform and facilities, which I think Usec has emphasized earlier. So here, we highlight the need to strengthen and link both local and global value chains. Growth conditions are available, but it is still also up to the MSMEs to grab the prospects. And furthermore, so I just want to zoom in on capacity building and mentoring programs I mentioned earlier. So this should start considering touching on both soft skills, hard skills, micro and macro perspectives touching on resource access, financing, down to specific areas such as crowdfunding, asset-based lending, fintech, seed and early stage financing, down to functional areas of management, total quality management, coping mechanism, which is very relevant during this pandemic, risk management, familiarity in business, regulatory, and economic policies. And this will allow our MSMEs to proficiently and confidently participate in a globalized business environment, not only because risks have been mitigated, but also because they are well equipped to strengthen their respective value chains. So in the end, the MSMEs are ready, but they still need assistance. And finally, helping enterprises grow and globalize would allow them to develop and exploit niche markets, expand businesses abroad, put local products into the world market. Globalized MSMEs can also generate more employment, higher income, contribute to the country's trade performance, and showcase not only the products of the Philippines, but the entire country to the world market. And this is a basic and yet effective tool to invite not only businessmen, investors, but also tourists, among others, to put their money in the local economy. And this will have an accelerator effect in driving venture growth. And as emphasized by the OECD, governments need to ensure that regulatory, administrative, and policy environments do not inhibit access to global markets. So it would benefit MSMEs, MSME trade, and FDI development. And on that note, thank you very much. So let's begin discussing how we can do things better as we transition to the better normal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera, for emphasizing that Philippine MSMEs can pursue entrepreneurial venture growth, harness the impact of external participation by considering a shift from what you said is a firm-centric to a value chain approach. Our second presenter will share with us the results of his research on survival analysis of export relationships of Philippine MSMEs. He is a holder of a PhD in economics degree from the University of New South Wales in Australia. He once served as a member commissioner of the Philippine Tariff Commission. Friends, help me welcome the Dean of the School of Economics of the University of Asia and the Pacific, Dr. George Manzano. Dr. Manzano.
Pleasant morning to all the participants of this symposium. I would like to thank Philippine APEC Study Center Network for supporting this research. This talk is about survivability of exports of export activities, to be exact, of MSMEs. First, the background. In 2015, the Philippines assumed the hosting of the APEC, and the host has the onus or the burden of coming up with a theme in advancing the cause of the APEC. It's meant to be progressive year after year. The theme chosen was quite appropriate, MSMEs, because of the importance of MSMEs in economic development. The sector is a great generator of jobs. Just reflecting on decimation of jobs during this current pandemic, we really need the sectors to be robust, no? to offer jobs, especially in the lead to the post-pandemic environment. In terms of count, they comprise 90% of firms. No surprise there. Yet, despite their high shares in employment and in number of firms, their contribution to the total product of the economy is not that high, suggesting that their productivity would be low. And so the literature on MSMEs is replete with studies on the constraints. No? What prevents the MSMEs from truly blossoming? And foremost among them will be finance. In contrast to the large firms, MSMEs are not really that bankable. They have high marginal tax rates as they transition from informal sectors towards more formal sectors. And they have issues with internationalization or venturing into international markets or exporting. They have constraints on finding a suitable partner. They face barriers in conforming to product standards, and they encounter problems in scaling up. Perhaps they can handle small orders very, very well, but when these orders are magnified several fold, then they have constraints in scaling up their operations, particularly looking for raw materials in order to support their production targets. And trade costs in general, especially transportation costs, especially in the light of today's constraints on very high container freight rates and the disruption of supply chain. And these are issues not to be trifled with. So therefore, how to nurture, transform, and strengthen the MSMEs are common themes in the research agenda. So this particular paper offers another window to understand the behavior of MSMEs. It takes a different track. It tries to document the duration of export relationship of MSMEs, meaning we'd like to find the time when the trade relation, when the MSME starts exporting a particular product until the time when that export activity ceases. And so the objectives of this paper is, of course, finding the trade duration, looking at the conditional probabilities that export relationships of a particular product from a sector that is dominated by MSMEs. What is the probability that that export relationship could stand, could operate for 1 year, for 2 years, for 3 years? Then secondly, we would be interested in looking and studying whether the duration of MSMEs export activities vary depending on who they're selling their products to, meaning do they vary depending on their trade partner. Now, documenting the duration of Philippine exports of MSMEs, this for us is interesting from both theoretical and policy perspectives. On the theoretical side, it's because there's almost like an implicit assumption in many trade models like Heckscher-Ohlin that trade relationships persist at the moment you exports, that exports can be sustained because the determinants of such exports are long-term in nature, such as factor endowments. And from a policy perspective, it could be interesting because if we could have a handle on the survivability characteristics of export relationships, it can help in crafting, government support interventions such as the duration of incentives. Now, in terms of methodology, we followed closely the study of Mercedes and Prusa. They did a similar study looking at the trade relationships, export rather, trade relationships of the US market. And they found out in their study that indeed these export relationships or trade relationships for that matter are rather brief. They do not last very long. And so they use Kaplan-Meier estimator, which is a statistical method used in the analysis of time to event data. And so we are interested in finding the time, the period from which the product is first exported until the time that that export activity ceases. So using this methodology, we came up with the conditional probabilities of survival of the trade relationships through time. We tried to establish that. Of course, I have to mention some very strong assumptions we adopted in making that study. And first is operational definition of MSMEs. Rather than use the conventional measure, which is asset size, for this particular study, we use employment size due to availability of data. Secondly, we use a representative firm to identify whether a sector that produces a particular good, the 6-digit level, is belongs to the MSME or is either a medium or large establishment. So that representative, and as we know, using the average size of the firm, that sector tends to conceal more than they reveal. So that's the assumption that we made. And the period from which the study was made was pretty much pre-COVID times. So the findings are findings. So this is what we call a Kaplan-Meier plot which shows the conditional probabilities of an export relationship, of products coming from industries or sectors which are dominated by MSMEs. No? So it just tells us the conditional probability that that export activity will continue after the second year, after the third year, after the fourth year. So we see from this plot that it's downward sloping, which means the probability that that export relationship will survive through time gets lower and lower as the time progresses, which means, the conditional probability of that an export relationship will persist for 1 year is high, but it will drop when you look at the probability that export relationships will persist for 2 years, and it will drop even further when we look at export relationships that last for 3 years. So it's downward sloping, but it starts to asymptote at a particular year. Here, roughly, we see it at the end of the 9th year. So we see there a rather sharp drop, which means that the survival, the survival of that export relationships is not sustained, through the years. Rather, it deteriorates and it reaches an asymptote. And this is for a particular market, which is Malaysia. The following slide also shows us the survival analysis of Philippine exports to Japan. Again, of course, downward sloping, and it basically starts to be asymptotic, to that 60%, between the 7th and 9th year of export relationships. Now, we conducted several of these conditional probabilities, and these are summarized in the following tables, of which we made different subsets of sample subsets. Here, we look at selected ASEAN trade partners, and one would notice that the conditional probabilities of surviving after 1 year is relatively high for the established, for the original ASEAN members, such as Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. But when you look into the trade relationship with the newer members of ASEAN, such as Cambodia and Vietnam, they're generally low compared to the original ASEAN members. We also conducted the same study, the same analysis with a number of developed countries or important export markets for which the Philippines enjoys an FTA through the ASEAN Plus One arrangement. And you can see here, we see it rather mixed. For Australia, for instance, Australia, our export products traded to Australia exhibited the highest survival rate with 86% after 1 year. Second highest here in this particular subset is Japan, with 63%. Okay, so we see them as rather mixed. So for the conclusion, in this paper, we report that trade relationships do not last a very long time. Usually at the 4th year, it starts to drop. In terms of survivability, the 4th year is generally quite critical across many markets. And this gives rise to some recommendations. First, because the Philippine exports of MSMEs exhibited relatively short trade durations, and that's consistent with the findings of other authors. There could be a case for government support to be tied up with the critical years of export survivability. So the government incentives can be extended until at least to the critical years for which export survivability is studied. Second, we can use survivability analysis as an additional monitoring mechanism of programs designed to support MSMEs. And lastly, there's of course scope for further research on the determinants of survivability. This study shall stop short in documenting the survivability, but investigating the determinants of the duration of trade relationships will be critical in uncovering the factors that will lead to a more extended survival rate of goods, particularly coming from MSMEs. So we suggest future papers can focus on such determinants. With that, I wish to thank you for coming over and for joining us in this symposium. We have to thank, and so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Manzano, for enlightening us that export relationships of the Philippines are brief, contrary to theories suggesting that most trade relationships are long-lived. Friends, we're now ready to listen to the results of the research work. This time, our third presenter is a lady certified public accountant and a full professor in accountancy. She obtained her PhD in business from De La Salle University, Manila, and was awarded the 2018 Most Outstanding Finance Educator. Here to share the highlights of her work on the role of entrepreneurs' financial sophistication on the nexus of business strategy and sustainability indicators of Philippine microenterprises. Let us warmly welcome Dr. Shivom D. Guliman of the MSU-Iligan Institute of Technology. Dr. Guliman.
Enterprises from all cities of the National Capital Region on how valuable it is to have financial sophistication for our SMEs so that it will increase their sustainability indicators. The challenges faced by Philippine MSMEs served as one of the motivations of this paper. A recent study by Francisco and Canaro in 2019 mentioned that these are the common challenges or concerns by our SMEs in the Philippines. And time and again, even our previous speakers have talked about this, that the lack of access to finance has been consistently cited by literature as one of the prevalent issues involving our MSMEs. However, earlier studies made by Aldaba in 2012 and Hampel Malagrosa et al. In 2015 mentioned that this issue is actually two-sided, that it is not only brought about by the supply side, but it is also brought about by the unsatisfactory financial statements, as well as the inadequate knowledge in accounting and finance of our entrepreneurs, implying that the entrepreneur's financial sophistication plays a role in this issue. Other issues revolving SMEs internationally, according to Hillary in 2000, is that it was purported as one of the biggest polluters in the world without much regard to environmental and social issues. However, Revel et al. In 2010 and Simpson et al. In 2004 cited that the increasing cognizance of environmental sustainability has finally reached the world of business, including the SME sector, although at a slower pace. And many SMEs have started to turn a new leaf and started to view environment and social responsibility not only as a responsibility, but as a strategy to gain better financial performance. Another pressing issue is how many of our entrepreneurs, especially in the Philippines, tend to be serial entrepreneurs, possibly because of poor financial performance and low market share, among others. But Balas et al. In 2014 and more in 2005 cited that those small businesses which adapted certain strategies helped the financial performance, implying a more sustainable enterprise. These issues actually became the motivations of the research framework of the study. So the primary objective of this study is to identify whether financial sophistication is a valuable resource that mediates the relationship between the business strategy, which is a second order construct, and sustainability indicators, namely economic, environmental, social, and governance. Financial sophistication was used as opposed to financial literacy, since the latter is often construed by many studies only as financial knowledge instead of a multidimensional construct. And the usual measure is that it's only measured as numeracy, knowledge and numeracy, and basic interest, among others. Thus, in this paper, financial sophistication was used and is used as a second order construct that is composed of financial behavior, financial attitude, financial knowledge, and financial decision-making style, of which the latter is not often used in many financial literacy studies. So as you can see in the structural equation, the relationships between the variables in this study were all positively and significant at 99% confidence level, but with varying coefficients. Stone-Geiser's Q-squared values show that the model has predictive relevance. To pass the measurement and structural model assessment, the financial knowledge construct has to be further subdivided into 3 blocks. That's why you can see there are 3 more indicators: for the time value of money, for the capital markets, and knowledge and accounting, to meet the unidimensional condition of the measurement model. Okay, so moving on. What then does that figure imply? So as you have seen in the figure, it appears that among the 4 typology of strategies of Miles and Snow, employing a prospector strategy will yield the highest on the sustainability indicators. Also, as seen in the framework, the adoption of a strategy is highly motivated by the possible outcomes as measured of enterprise sustainability as compared to non-financial measure, considering that the path coefficients to economic is the largest among the 4 sustainability indicators. Nonetheless, the path coefficient in relation to environmental, social, and governance were smaller relative to economic. The positive and statistically significant relationship showed that MSMEs were starting to as MSME is starting to gradually turn a new leaf on how they view an enterprise sustainability and have started to appreciate and employ initiatives that will make them environmentally and socially sustainable. Still, a lot has to improve on the aspect of good governance. The findings of this study calls for increased attention in good governance for MSMEs, considering its possible positive effects on the overall sustainability indicators of the enterprise. So on the financial sophistication, based on the results, the path coefficient between the direct effects of the business strategy on the individual sustainability indicators range only from 0.06 to 0.019. But the indirect effect of the business strategy on the individual SIs with the presence of financial sophistication augmented the relationship with a much higher coefficient, that is 0.301. This only showed that the combined effects of human capital, that is financial sophistication in this study, and business strategy provide an overall enhanced performance for our enterprises. So looking at the first order constructs, contrary to some of the findings in prior literature that financial knowledge is key, but here it is found that it is actually the financial behavior of our entrepreneurs as indicated by the indicators involving investing, planning, saving, and budgeting have the highest path coefficient, signifying that it is, if it's this dimension that will be further improved, then we will have a better enterprise sustainability. And then second is the financial decision-making style, and last is the financial knowledge. So in the financial decision-making style, as you have seen, which is close to financial behavior, it only shows that an individual or an entrepreneur that is more interested in long-term goals, likely to be reflective and slow to act when considering and weighing alternatives, and systematic in the application of specific factual information in guiding choices when making decisions helps a lot in the sustainability indicators of our enterprises. So on the financial knowledge, the knowledge in accounting plays a very significant and higher role in the assumed relationship compared to the time value of money and capital markets. So it must be noted that the limitations of this study concerning that it could not be generalized to a bigger population, because most of the respondents of this study only were 3 to 10 years, and that they are micro enterprises. And then the other limitations in this study, still the findings of this study would want to recommend to our policymakers that concerned agencies may design programs particularly focused on improving the entrepreneur's financial behavior given the results, and that if it is possible, if they give importance primarily on accounting concepts and knowledge, so that our entrepreneurs will be able to meet the stringent requirements of the financial institutions. It's because it's actually this one that also hinders their ability to access to finance, because they don't have enough financial statements to show to the banks and others. And lastly, if capacity building would also be given, then it would be encouraged that more entrepreneurs to give equal consideration to the 4 areas of sustainability and not only on the economic or on the financial indicator. And lastly, concerned agencies may provide better incentives to those who are environmentally and socially responsible entrepreneurs, given that the bulk of the businesses here in the Philippines are actually from our MSME sector. So for our entrepreneurs, although I know it's difficult now given the COVID situation, that most of our idea would just be to really survive, if it's possible, our entrepreneurs would adopt a prospector strategy while enhancing positive financial behavior, as you have seen from the results, because it will really amplify the relationship onto the sustainability indicators. So if it's possible, despite the difficulty that we're facing because of the pandemic, we'll strive to innovate, design new products, create new markets, search for new opportunities. So despite everything that's going through, there will always be a silver lining. There will always be opportunities that we can find. Devote themselves to entrepreneurial tasks. And lastly, it is suggested to have an analyst-centered decision-making style as opposed to the realist pragmatist. So you have to take consideration carefully when you are making decision and enhance knowledge in accounting if possible. And lastly, I am encouraging, if we have entrepreneurs here, to give the same priority and attention to the other aspects of sustainability and not just on the economic sense, particularly on the environment, society, and good governance. And that ends my presentation. Good morning.
Indeed, financial sophistication, which includes behavior, decision-making style, attitude, and knowledge as a key human capital resource, positively affects the business strategy of MSMEs. Thank you, Dr. Guliman, for sharing with us the results of that very valuable study of yours. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will be taken by our fourth and last presenter to the road to recovery and resilience for Philippine MSMEs post-COVID-19. Our presenter has an MA Economics degree from the University of Ottawa and an MA Economics from the University of the Philippines. Friends, let us welcome the Associate Director and Senior Economist at the Asian Institute of Management, Rizalino S. Navarro Policy Center for Competitiveness, Mr. John Paul Flamingan.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Gloria, for that introduction. Please just give me a second to share my slides. All right, I think we're all set. Well, first off, I'd like to thank the PIDS, the PASCN network, and the UA&P for inviting us to share the results of our MSME report. So this is actually the first in a series of two MSME surveys and reports during COVID. Unfortunately, we're still in the data cleaning stages of the second report, but we have a lot to unpack here in this first report, which uses data from Q4 2020 and gives us some perspective on what MSMEs actually went through in the Philippines. So I'm going to quickly skip through these slides because the importance of MSMEs in our economy has already been established by our previous presenters. But what I would like to note here is that, well, the AIM Policy Center has always had SME competitiveness as one of its major research tracks. However, this year, due to COVID, we chose to include micro enterprises, which was a fairly new research for us, simply because micro enterprises were among the hardest hit, even among small businesses, as I'll show you all later. So obviously, MSMEs contribute a lot to output, employment, even net exports. And here's one of the reasons why we initially didn't want to include micro enterprises from our SME research. It's because micro enterprises, which have 3 million pesos and below in terms of assets and 9 employees or less, are sort of structurally different, especially when compared to the medium-sized enterprises, which have upwards of 15 million pesos in terms of assets and over 100 employees. So one of the reasons why small businesses are hit harder during crises such as this pandemic is because of the liability of smallness, where small businesses usually experience a decrease in demand for their products. As mentioned earlier, they face financing constraints and lack of access to finance. Lack of access to technology and market access, among many other challenges that they face. However, one thing that small businesses do have going on for them, primarily because of their flatter organizational structures, is that they're able to pivot more quickly. And during this pandemic, we've seen small businesses make changes more quickly to their business models and adopt innovations such as get into digital technologies and digital logistics and the like. So even if MSMEs suffer from the liability of smallness, they're less bogged down by bureaucratic inertia, which enables them to pivot quicker compared to their larger counterparts. So the survey that we ran, well, this was during, I think, GCQ, during Q4 2020, covered 700 SMEs in NCR and Calabarzon and focused on the immediate impact of COVID on their operations, as well as on their coping behavior, or whether or not they employed certain business strategies such as product differentiation, cost leadership, and the like. So the distribution of firms in our survey was, it's almost a 50% split between manufacturing and services. Obviously, since our sample area was NCR and Calabarzon, there really weren't that many agriculture-based small businesses to begin with in these areas. So we chose to focus on manufacturing and services. Half of the sample were small businesses, while the other quarter were micro and the other quarter were medium-sized. So we used a mixed method survey since government restrictions on gatherings were still in effect during this time. So some firms we were able, the survey firm was able to survey face-to-face, but the others who weren't able to be reached face-to-face were interviewed via Zoom, hence the mixed methods. But we still employed multi-stage random sampling, and the time frame was during from the first week of September until the last week of October 2020. And then we primarily interviewed the heads or owners of the businesses or the general manager of day-to-day operations. And all these firms were or renewed their business license in 2020 and should be classified as an MSME based on the two categories I showed you earlier, asset size and employment. So 64% of our respondents were male, 36% were female, and the average age was around 49 years old. These respondents were generally highly educated. A lot had at least a college degree or higher. And although there's a good distribution of or even distribution of firm age, the owner age distribution was a little skewed towards the 45 to 54-year-old age range, as well as the 55 to 64-year-old age range. And for a lot of these small businesses, actually most of these small businesses said that COVID was the most prominent shock that they've ever experienced, and most of them didn't even experience any other natural or man-made disaster type or even financial shock prior to COVID. So this really hit small businesses as a surprise. So about 6 months into the crisis, 62% of the firms we interviewed were already fully open and operating at pre-COVID levels. However, it is very important to note or take this with a grain of salt, because the firms that we were able to survey were only the firms who were still at least partly operational during that time. So firms who didn't survive the crisis didn't make it to our sample. So there's some sort of selection bias going on here, in that we were only able to survey firms who were still operational at least until September or October 2020. And for firms that were partially open or that experienced temporarily shutting down, one of the I guess the major initiatives that they took was to run at a limited capacity because most of the employees weren't able to come to work, primarily due to the lack of public transportation during this lockdown period. So the lack of public transportation was particularly cumbersome for small businesses. It was mentioned earlier, actually a couple of times, that the lack of access to finance is a major roadblock for MSME survival or even growth. But we tried to quantify through a survey how much they actually need. So it came as a surprise to us that most of these MSMEs in our sample, actually almost 69%, declared that they need only less than 100,000 pesos to return to and sustain full operations. Again, now this amount, 100,000 pesos, may be subjective. It could mean a lot more to a micro enterprise compared to a medium enterprise who operates at a much larger scale. So about 3/4 of MSMEs we surveyed had to reduce their operating hours as a result of the pandemic, and about 60% actually temporarily shut down their operations. So the next section of our survey focused on the strategies or the business strategies that they took in order to try and survive the crisis, particularly differentiation, cost leadership, and focus. And we found that generally, a lot of the firms in our sample employed differentiation business strategies as a measure, such as trying to take the lead in marketing a new product or having innovative, promotional strategies. Cost leadership was another popular strategy for these SMEs during this time. A lot of the firms that we surveyed declared that they employed cost reduction in all of their business activities, and they also largely focused on reducing production costs. However, as a business strategy, not that many firms employed focus in terms of producing, say, one single unique product or limiting the number of products that they offer. So even among micro, small, and medium enterprises, we see that although generally these small businesses employed more cost leadership in differentiations business strategies to cope with the pandemic, it's more the medium and small firms that were able to try and pivot and make changes to their business strategies as opposed to micro firms. So micro firms didn't really employ, say, product or pricing differentiation strategies compared to their smaller and medium-sized counterparts. Well, fortunately, outlook on survival was largely positive for most of the, well, a majority, over 60% of the firms in our sample. And they also believe that they do possess the ability to withstand the challenges of the crisis. But again, it's worth noting that these firms we surveyed were already the ones who were surviving during the crisis. In terms of sales recovery, about 61% of these firms believe that their sales would rebound to pre-crisis levels, despite experiencing both a decrease in sales and sales volume in the last 6 months. So this is another area I'd like to highlight here, how micro firms seem to languish more compared to their smaller and medium-sized counterparts. So on the left-hand side here, we see the percent of pre-crisis monthly sales revenues that the firms were earning, while medium and small enterprises were already making around close to 60% of their pre-crisis monthly sales revenue. Micro enterprises, on the other hand, were only making about half of their pre-crisis sales revenues. On the right-hand side, we have pre-crisis monthly net profit or net income. Again, the same pattern here. In that small and medium-sized firms were making around half of what they were making pre-pandemic in terms of net profit or income. But again, micro enterprises are left way behind, making only around 43%. So despite the positive outlook, medium and small enterprises obviously fared better in terms of revenues and profit compared to their micro counterparts, who earned a substantially smaller portion of their pre-crisis revenues and profit relative to their small and medium counterparts. Here's another interesting section we'd like to highlight in the study, support through the crisis and BCPs, or business continuity plans. So when the community quarantine hit last March 16, 2020, about 62% of small businesses here in our survey had not yet started working on a BCP. And notably, only 19%, less than 19% had a BCP in place. And again, same story here, smaller micro firms compared to small and medium firms were much less likely to implement a BCP. So in terms of, just to wrap things up, in terms of the support that these firms need from the government, it's obviously access to financial assistance or direct subsidies, and then it's worth noting that although these firms, most of these firms require some sort of financial assistance, the amount that they generally need isn't necessarily that large. So in terms of policy implications, it's very important for us to prepare our small businesses for disaster resilience, such as making them have business continuity plans or BCPs, and making them more financially and digitally literate so they can shift or pivot towards digitization and use these new platforms to expand their reach. So I believe my time is up. I'm sorry for exceeding for about
Yes.
30 seconds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Flaminiano. Indeed, COVID-19 has adversely affected businesses, especially the small ones, though there's a ray of hope provided by small businesses which are able to thrive in unprecedented situations. We're now ready for questions to our presenters. For Dr. Rivera, did you consider or capture tax incentive benefits to MSMEs in your study? For Dr. Manzano, what are the MSME export survivability risk factors and their significance? For Dr. Goliman, is there a connection between the tax regime and more formal financial disclosures and governance? And finally, for Mr. Flaminiano, what can be done within the next 6 months to put the micro and small businesses back on their feet? There you have it. Those are the questions for our 4 presenters.
Hey, Dr. Futalan, may I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so regarding the question on tax incentives, though we were able to briefly mention it in the paper, but we did not really discuss it in detail because we were trying to focus on alternative forms of support to our MSMEs on top of tax incentives, because considering the current situation of our country, tax revenues for the government would ideally be very helpful in actually managing this pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. Can we hear from Dr. Manzano?
Regarding the questions on risk characteristics, though the paper did not look into this particular aspect directly, let me just share some of the characteristics that has been uncovered in the literature. First is homogeneous versus differentiated goods. The survivability, or how long that export relationship duration been studied between homogeneous and differentiated goods. And differentiated goods seems to have a longer trade duration than homogeneous, although this particular study was conducted in another market. I'm not quite sure. I think it's in the Latin American market. I would surprise. I would look into search costs perhaps would be an interesting issue, like the relevant partners, because when you have a new product and you're just starting to sell it, you're not sure about the, because we're talking about export markets, we're not sure about the buyer, and so that may be a risk factor on search costs. For that matter, I think market intelligence would be an investment that would be that could mitigate the uncertainty over the search cost. However, because it is an investment and we're talking about financially constrained by nature, sectors such as SMEs, particularly when they start internationalization, this could be a tall order. Another risk factor could be scaling up in the sense that they may be very good in meeting short orders, but when once they enter the big leagues, when they go into big buyers such as I don't know, Macy's or big supermarket chains in the US, they might have a hard time scaling up operations because of logistical constraints. Then, although this other aspect is not yet researched, it will be interesting to find out whether trade duration of products that belong, intermediate products that belong within a value chain or a supply chain would have higher durations than those which are final goods. So these, I think, uh, are facets of research directions that can be done in the course of looking into risk factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manzano. Hi, George. We now listen to Dr. Guliman as she tackles her question.
So yeah, it's really very important, the tax regime and I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs complaining about that. And the accounting knowledge, although it came out late at just very small coefficient on that, but it is also a factor, as you have seen, it's positively related. So, and then the formal financial disclosures, which is not yet, it is supposed to be implemented, and our MSME should have that. And even from the base of my research, in the descriptives, there were really a lot of them that do not, when I asked them whether they prepare financial statements, most of them, they would say that it is only prepared when necessary. So I think that's a thing that we should also be improving on, because they would only prepare it when it is already asked. So they don't really keep it for monitoring or for evaluation purposes, whether their financial data is already doing good. So that's a thing that we need to improve on. And it's because they would always say that they don't know about it, or even if they know about it, or they would just hire someone, and if hiring someone would mean additional cost for them. So I think, yeah, for for many of our concerned agencies here, may we also focus on that, so that it's not financial disclosures and financial accounting data would not only give our MSMEs an edge to apply for loans in our financial institution, but also for monitoring whether they're doing good or not in the long run. Because we have a lot of serial entrepreneurs here. So I hope I was able to answer that.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Shivon. There's a question for Dr. or Mr. Flaminiano. Paul, did you get your question?
Yes, very hard question. What can be done? So I'll try to answer that. Thank you for the question. Despite the challenges that small businesses face, I think literacy can be sort of an equalizer and kind of level the playing field with their larger counterparts. Now, what do I mean by this? Number one, BCP literacy, or business continuity plan literacy, a concept where that a lot of us weren't aware of before the pandemic. This is very important, and small businesses have to be aware that you don't have to be a large corporation like an SM or a Jollibee to have a BCP. Even small firms would really benefit from having a disaster resilience and readiness plan. So that's number one, BCP literacy. Number two would be digital financial literacy. This entails taking up both financial and digital technology literacy, which would really open up a world of opportunities for MSMEs by giving them access to new platforms and new markets. So those are the two things that we're advocating in the report. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Flaminiano. This is a question for all panelists. Would you say that the sales consistency of small, medium, and micro enterprises was driven during the pandemic due to government regulations? This is considering that demand wouldn't have drastically changed when the pandemic was declared. Anyone?
If I may begin, I think in addition to that, I'd like to add that uncertainty also caused a huge dip in in demand. It's because of the lack of confidence in, if you can't, in going out even, and doing things as simple as going about your normal routines and buying food or things that you need from the market. So with uncertainty, this really caused a huge dip in confidence, which in turn decreased demand for products.
And if I may add to that,
All right. Yes, Dr. Rivera.
well, in addition to the uncertainty, the unprecedented impacts of the pandemic, particularly the loss of income due to loss of jobs, also affected significantly the demand for during the times of pandemic. And that has to be addressed. I mean, how can we rebound? How can we return back the income earning capacities of our consumers?
Great.
Yes, can I
Yes,
add?
yes, Dr. Manzano.
Yes, I think well, you have a confluence here of supply side and demand side. On the demand side, it's because of the loss of income of people, inability to, because of closures, then restrictions on gathering and on selling. So that's basically an issue on purchasing power. But on the supply side, it's also the lockdown, the logistical issues, the difficulty of bringing farms, of bringing products to the market. All the checkpoints, and as we know, especially in agricultural products, these are very, they have expiry dates, so to speak, so perishable items. And so this confound the particular problems. But looking forward, really, when we think about the COVID, it is really a great disruptor. And it's time that, especially among MSMEs and general industries in particular, it's about the whole world is forced to digitalize. The whole world is accelerating and rethinking about labor issues, like robotics, artificial intelligence. When can machines replace the call centers that we have so many in the Philippines now? Because COVID has basically forced industries to speed up their investments on artificial intelligence and digitalization. And secondly, all the questions about onshoring, keeping production close to their markets, which is really like a spanner in the works in terms of our export plans and our supply chains. So just some issues to think about, especially with MSMEs, which are more vulnerable to these developments. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. From Dr. Guliman, would you want to respond?
I agree with the panelists, and that there is really a dip, although there are also a shift in the demand. It's understandable why people are not spending, because people are tightening their ropes, making sure that they still have enough funds for the future, because we are in an uncertain times. So although there was also a shift in demand for other products, like for example, those that are in line with for health. So it's just a matter of how our government would also capacitate our MSMEs and trying to shift on which is the product or which is the demand that is kind of being followed now by the market. So yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I agree more with with my co-panelists.
All right. Congratulations to all the presenters, and of course to the organizers of the symposium. As I say, everybody looks forward to possible collaborative work in the not so distant future. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Futalan, for that very engaging and concise session, and also to our presenters for that very enriching discussion. Now we are down to our end of this symposium. To give the closing remarks, we have the director of the APEC Business Advisory Council, or ABAC, International Secretariat. Ambassador Antonio Basilio is a self-confessed APEC junkie which started when he was part of the Philippine delegation to the founding meeting of APEC in 1989 in what was then the Gazebo Hotel in Sydney. He subsequently attended the inaugural meeting in Canberra later that year and has had continuing participation in the APEC process, initially as a public official and subsequently from the private sector. To close, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Basilio.
Thank you, Beng. Appreciate the generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I realize that I stand between you and lunch, so I will try to be brief. Let me first thank the University of Asia and the Pacific, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, and the Philippine APEC Study Center for organizing this important event and for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of ABAC, its views on this challenge. Thank you to the moderators and the speakers for the enlightening presentation, which has helped for a better understanding of the magnitude of this challenge and identifying a possible response. I note in particular the update on the BAA. We are pleased to note the tremendous progress being made in its implementation, but disappointed at the level of participation by the economies. The growing of MSMEs has always been in the core agenda of ABAC, in recognition of the fact that across the region, MSMEs are the backbone of Asia-Pacific economic development. These businesses, including women and indigenous people-led MSMEs, struggle to engage successfully in cross-border trade, digital platforms and e-commerce, as well as global value chains. Addressing these challenges requires concerted efforts across a number of fronts. Factors such as population growth, technological disruption, and economic and trade turbulence, such as we are experiencing now, further hinder the development of these enterprises as they are affected more deeply due to their more vulnerable contexts. MSMEs face structural challenges around business readiness, access to information, financing and networks, and challenges in the domestic regulatory and business environment. We have advocated actions that would help MSMEs to participate more successfully in global value chains and trade, including capacity building and increasing business readiness, as well as reducing NTBs and services trade barriers. ABAC has also been working on a number of initiatives focusing on mentorship, which combines best practices sharing with on-the-ground workshops, toolkits geared toward individual economies, and APEC-wide mentorship linkages, which aim to support MSMEs in their growth journey. And I think Dr. Rivera talked about this at length, much appreciated. ABAC is also addressing the issue of online disputes by seeking to build a region-wide framework for online dispute resolution platforms, which will both reduce the time taken to resolve and reduce legal cost. We have asked APEC to support ABAC's initiatives to develop MSME dispute resolution tools to assist as MSMEs in readiness to internationalize. Over the years, we have urged APEC to develop policies to improve MSMEs' access to the digital economy, especially those in remote areas and vulnerable groups, including persons with disabilities. We have also looked at innovative finance, whether provided by new players with new business models or by incumbent institutions that have developed innovative services or in partnership with fintech firms, which we think are critical to addressing the obstacles in the flow of financing to MSMEs. We have advocated improving the financial infrastructure that would enable banks to make risk-based lending decisions to MSMEs rather than through collateral-based lending. So let me now move to the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. MSMEs are amongst the groups most impacted by COVID-19 and are facing a sharp collapse in earnings, unpayable office operation costs, and falling demand for goods and services. Many face the prospect of permanent closure. To address these challenges, we have put forward a number of recommendations. These include actions to address the pandemic itself, temporary and tailored fiscal support, particularly to address the economic consequences to MSMEs. To assist MSMEs to address operational challenges, we have recommended the following: intensifying efforts to enhance the financial inclusion of MSMEs and their participation in international trade through a more robust enabling environment and capacity building for digital transformation. Alleviating liquidity challenges where needed through temporary support measures and emergency credit programs tailored to the specific circumstances of MSMEs and economies, including offering financial support, for example, loan payment holidays, low interest liquidity funds to keep business running, keep their workforce, and expand financial ability to pay costs. And I think a number of our presenters touched on this, particularly Dr. Francis Kiamba. Business on their own have done their part in helping MSMEs to address their operational challenges. Also, we ask that APEC consider in specific circumstances providing incentives, income or consumption measures to stimulate consumer demand to help local business and boost the local economy. Facilitating speedy restructuring of non-viable businesses and accelerate fresh starts of insolvent businesses by streamlining personal insolvency regimes and exploiting newly established online dispute platforms to speed and lower the cost of insolvency, and introducing well-designed support programs where needed. And then another recommendation touched upon by many of our presenters, facilitating the shift of MSMEs to e-commerce and digital platforms through capacity building, including through training and retraining programs and upskilling. Now, as economies move through the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, we will need to strengthen the resiliency of MSMEs for future disruptions. And among the measures we have recommended are the following: enabling better, more inclusive access to financial services. And as Dr. Guliman mentioned, the importance of financial sophistication in order for MSMEs to access these services. Appointing within economies multidisciplinary advisory bodies, including government and non-government agencies and business representatives, to advise on MSME resilience and ways of simplifying the operating environment for MSMEs. Facilitating MSMEs' capacity to adjust to the new or better normal of business post-COVID-19, including supporting MSMEs' digital transformation for remote work and operations, preparedness for cybersecurity threats through providing framework to protect them from attacks, training, business continuity protocols, adequate information systems with built-in security layers, among others. MSMEs will need to be ready for the contactless and cashless economy, and digital connectivity will need to be strengthened to ensure that it is affordable and reliable as more of our daily activities takes place online. Last year, we implemented a pilot project focused on MSME resilience and growth intended to identify policy recommendations for MSMEs within APEC, and those include business continuity and supply chain continuity, as alluded to by Dr. Plamignano and also by George Manzano. We have launched a portal that contains best practices of measures taken to help MSMEs to weather the storm. And this year, we are pushing for the adoption of digital payments ecosystem through enabling legal and regulatory framework. Finally, women generally receive lower incomes, represent the majority of single-parent households, and are more likely to be employed in MSMEs and the informal sector. These factors have been exacerbated amid the COVID-19 pandemic, generating a setback in inclusion and gender equality. To mitigate the negative impacts of the pandemic and to continue advancing toward full gender equality, ABAC has encouraged policymakers to take into account the particular vulnerabilities, pre-existing discrimination, and inequality, and threatened well-being that women face developing and implementing COVID-19 economic recovery plans. We believe that the faster policymakers and business leaders act to push for greater gender equality, even as the COVID-19 crisis continues, the bigger the benefits, both for gender equality and economic growth. I'd like to point our participants to the ABAC website, where we have details of all these proposals or recommendations, and also to follow our tweet, including that series where we gave examples of businesses doing their role or in the COVID-19 crisis. On that note, I will end my remarks and thank everyone for their attention.
Thank you once again, Ambassador Basilio, for that closing remarks. Also, thanks again to our speakers and moderators for a very engaging and lively discussion. So we apologize for the overtime, but this will be very quick. Some final reminders before we go. To all our speakers, your certificates of appreciation will be delivered to you. To all the participants, you may also request for your certificates by sending us an email. And to the representatives of the member institutions, please be reminded of the General Assembly in a few minutes at 1 p.m. And lastly, the Philippines will be hosting the APEC Global MSME Forum next week on June 28 to June 30, 2021. Through the forum, DTI seeks to bring together participants from the 21 APEC member economies, including policymakers, MSMEs, industry and business leaders, officials of international organizations, and members of the academia. So that officially wraps our symposium. From UA&P, PIDS, and PASCN, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next symposium.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone. Beng and
Thank you, Sir George.
and Mela and Gwen and Lisa and all the panelists, as well as PIDS staff. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much. Bye.
Hi. How are you doing? It's us, UA&P. Before moving forward, let's go back, shall we? COVID-19 hit. Classes got suspended. Alternatives were being devised for academics, extracurricular activities, and family life. Since times have changed, we need to bring something different. Effective. Safe. Now with the new normal, UA&P is ready for you. This will only work if we do this together. Are you with me?
So what is PIDS? For over 40 years, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, has been the country's foremost socio-economic think tank. It conducts rigorous and objective policy research and analyses that help the government in crafting relevant policies, plans, and programs in support of the country's long-term vision and development goals. PIDS pursues its mandate through three basic programs: research, dissemination, and outreach. Through its research program, PIDS identifies and prioritizes studies, develops proposals, and conducts research on priority areas. The results of these studies are then disseminated through different platforms, publications, online resources, PIDS Corner, seminars, and the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, held every September. To shed light on key policy issues, the advice and expertise of the Institute's research fellows are also sought by policymakers, government agencies, private sector, and civil society. Since 1977, PIDS has completed numerous policy studies on a wide range of development topics. This brand of service has then translated to policies and programs that have improved the lives of every Filipino. Philippine Institute for Development Studies, service through policy research.
In need of references for your research? Do you want a search engine that is easy to navigate? And do you want it free? If you are a student, researcher, or teacher looking for socioeconomic references and materials, then CERPI is for you. To access CERPI, just visit the PIDS website at www.pids.gov.ph and click the CERPI widget. Or type serp-p.pids.gov.ph. CERPI is an online database of socioeconomic studies and materials produced by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies and other academic and research institutions. CERPI has a wide variety of socioeconomic materials such as journal articles, books, working papers, policy notes, research papers, and newsletters. CERPI has 52 partner institutions that contribute publications to the database. CERPI has a wide coverage of materials encompassing 20 research themes. You can search by keyword or author, by publication type, by research theme, or year published. CERPI has more than 7,000 materials with full text that you can download for free. Enjoy searching! Visit CERPI now and follow us on Facebook. You may also send a message for inquiries.